everyone, there is no planned fire drill, so if the fire alarm does go off, it is a call to evacuate the building. Please exit through the doors, down the stairs and into the car park. Please don't use the lifts, so we'll direct you and help you on the way.
Thank you. So the examination is being supported by Louise St John Howe, who's sitting in the back corner, who's the programme officer. If you've got any queries about the examination, please get in touch with Louise in the first instance. The website is being regularly updated and the examination pages will host the latest documents that have been uploaded. So these examination hearings are being held in public and are being live streamed and recorded. However, only those who submitted duly made representations on the proposed submission version of the plan, those are the representations made in July to September, and who have expressed their right to be heard will be able to speak and participate. The format of these hearings is intended to be inquisitorial but reasonably informal. We will lead the discussion based on, firstly, our assessment of the soundness issues, which we reflected in our matters, issues and questions, and secondly, our recently published agendas. There'll be no direct questioning of other participants. The Isle of Wight Council has legal representation in Mr. Bedford KC, but to assure those around this table, there will be no cross-examination of witnesses. So we as inspectors will steer the discussion through a series of questions. Most of the questions will be directed to the council as it's their plan. We will seek to bring in others at the relevant points. If you wish to come in and make comment, please append your nameplate, and that will signal to us. That's fine. I was going to demonstrate, but I can't see it, so I can't pick it up. I'll sort it in a minute. Yeah, thank you very much. And that will draw our attention that you want to say something, and we can bring you in. So please remember, you can only discuss points related to your representations. These hearings are not an opportunity to widen your issues of interest or to make completely new points. While we're on nameplates, can you turn them around so we can see your names? Thank you. So this morning's session concerns itself with the amount of housing development needed on the island. We've read the representations and statements that have been made. There's no need to read out any statements to us. The aim of these hearings is to help inform our assessment as to whether the plan in respect of the amount of housing development needed on the island is sound, which means that it is justified, effective, positively prepared and consistent with national policy. What will be helpful to us is that where you consider the plan is not justified or is not going to be effective, to tell us what needs to be changed to the plan and why. So are there any initial questions on how this morning's session will work before we begin? No? Okay, thank you. So before we turn to the agenda, and for the benefit of all those in the room and anyone watching online, we please just go around the table and invite you all to briefly introduce yourself. Perhaps we'll start with the council's team. Mr. Bedford.
Thank you, sir. My name's Michael Bedford, King's Counsel. I'm barrister assisting the council with the examination, and I certainly haven't cross-examined anybody for quite a while, I can tell you.
Thank you, sir. Morning, James Brewer. I'm the Planning Policy Manager at the Isle of Wight Council.
Good morning, Chris Mills, Principal Planning Officer, Isle of Wight Council.
Good morning, James Beverley, I'm Vice Chairman on behalf of Jackton Properties.
Good morning, I'm Lindsay Goodyear, representing Smallbrook Developments, who have the Penny Feathers site in Wight.
My name is Chris Jarman. I'm an Isle of Wight councillor for the wonderful ward of Totland and Cornwall. I'm also a Totland Parish Councillor and a Freshwater Parish Councillor.
My name's David Long, Planning and Development Consultant at BCM Wilson Hill, representing various clients and industries.
Good morning, sirs. Mark Barrett from the Home Builders Federation.
Morning, Justin, gentlemen. I'm from Foreland Homes. I'm an Isle of Wight developer that have been operating here since 2002. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to me. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm David Spencer, introduced as obviously one of the two inspectors. Again, you're going to be dealing with me, I'm afraid, for most of today. So I'll be taking you through this morning's matter in relation to housing need and requirement, and then this afternoon we'll look at the associated issue of the spatial strategy contained within the island planning strategy in terms of the distribution of kind of various development needs and requirements. In terms of this, before I just come on to introduce this first issue, I just do want to briefly raise one housekeeping matter with the council as a follow-up to yesterday's discussion. It relates to the integrated sustainability appraisal. Obviously, we've got EA2 that accompanies the plan. Council's uploaded, I'll call it Regulation 18.1 as ED11. Presumably there's another one, Regulation 18.2. Is that, I've looked in various places on the examination library, but is that something that needs to be added?
I have a feeling it may be appended to the ISA that we submitted for this plan, but we'll double check, and if it isn't, obviously we'll make sure it gets uploaded. So
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, that's the only housekeeping issue I had from yesterday. Thank you for that. So if I turn now to matter 2, an agenda was distributed, I think last week in relation to this session. We're going to look at two things. Firstly, we're going to look at housing need, and then we're going to look at the housing requirement. They are two separate things. The housing need is the level of housing required in terms of sort of demographic and other purposes. The housing requirement can be something different in terms of the amount of housing to be planned for. It can be the same as the housing need. It could be higher. It could be lower for various reasons. They do not necessarily, one does not automatically flow from the other. So I want to sort of draw that distinction to everybody's attention. In relation to the housing need, if we turn to that first matter 2, it's issue 2. Obviously, national planning policy contained within the national planning policy framework. And obviously, we're working to the December 2023 version of the NPPF, given the timing of when this island planning strategy was submitted for examination. Sets out that it's obviously the starting point is wherever possible to use the government's standard method for calculating a housing need, but it includes within paragraph 61 of the NPPF by specific reference to footnote 25 that there may be exceptional circumstances where it may be justified to take a different approach for particular demographic reasons or characteristics for an alternative to the government's standard method approach. So I'd like to turn first to the council. I think this is really in follow-up to our matters and issues questions, really sort of 2.5 through to 2.9. The reasonableness in the council's opinion of using the standard method, which is what you've done, or you don't dispute the standard method as the means of calculating the starting point of the housing need for the island, as opposed to whether there are the exceptional circumstances given. Some might be led to believe or led to kind of interpret that paragraph 61 footnote 25 had a specific location in mind. I mean, it is potentially quite geographically constrained. So yes, understanding the council's reasonableness for using the standard method, why we shouldn't be looking, or why in the council's view there are not the kind of the exceptional circumstances. Thank you.
thank you, sir. And yeah, absolutely. So the council's position in this plan is very much to the standard method for establishing the housing need, then moving into discussions which we'll have later on housing requirement and the extent to that can be met. This issue's run through for a number of years now through the plan making process, and the council's committed a lot of time and work on this particular topic because we are aware that there are some demographic challenges on the island, and that potentially presents some circumstances that we might want to take account of. However, the fundamental point is that the council's seen no evidence to suggest that those exceptional circumstances exist. The council itself has undertaken a large degree of demographic work, both from Royal Demographic, Lambeth Smith Hampton and Jill Hearn, to look into this particular matter. And again, we did some update work following the footnote that appeared in the MPPF back in late 2023. However, none of that work suggested that there were exceptional circumstances that should point us in a direction of doing a different calculation of need. And I think a really couple of important points to make on that are that just because you go down that particular route, that doesn't necessarily mean the outcome is going to be a significantly lower number. It could be significantly higher. And also the other things you have to take account of when you're thinking about exceptional circumstances are past under delivery of housing, and you still have to make sure any calculation of housing need reflects market and demographic signals. So whilst we may have particular demographic characteristics on the island, simply ignoring them or taking elements of those out wouldn't necessarily be reflective of those market signals and trends. So the council's position is very, very firm on this, that we do not have any evidence in front of us that suggests there is an alternative method of calculating housing need that is appropriate for the island. And obviously we've got various background documents that support that, HO50, and obviously you recently submitted, I think in ED9 it is, to the examination, which was the updated demographic work, which we undertook post MPPF 2023.
So could I just add on the policy side of things, just in terms of what the MPPF says, and obviously drawing attention, as you have, to that new footnote. But firstly, the basic text is simply recognising that there may be exceptional circumstances. And then obviously we've got the footnote, and that also is expressed in the contingent. Demographic characteristics could, for example, not, will or do, etc. And the point that's actually quite striking, we would say, is that if you think about local planning authorities which are responsible for generating a local housing need, there are, we think, probably only two which are islands in England. That's to say the Isle of Wight and the Isles of Scilly, because all the other islands are either not in England, like Anglesey or the Isle of Man or so on, or they are islands which are part of the administrative area of a mainland local planning authority. So given that kind of very narrow compass, it would have been incredibly easy if the government actually thought that the circumstances of the two islands which are local planning authorities are special. It would have been very easy for them to have either referred to them directly by name or to have used the word would or does, etc., or something that wasn't contingent. They obviously chose not to do so because they clearly wanted to ensure that there had to be an evidence base to demonstrate exceptional circumstances, and not simply say, you're an island, therefore you have exceptional circumstances. So that's a factor that we have taken into account, that you do need to actually justify the exceptional circumstances. You can't simply say it follows we're an island. And that's what we have done through the exercises, including the more recent Lambert Smith Herbert work, which you have, Lambert Smith Hampton, I apologise to them, the Lambert Smith Hampton work, which we put in as an ED document, and obviously Mr. Brewer has rehearsed what we think about that, and you will have seen we've got our evidence paper HO 15 on exceptional circumstances, which runs through the demographic considerations and the conclusions that we've reached interpreting that demographic data. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of the council's assessment and sort of consideration, you've applied to yourself and asked the question, you know, are there the exceptional circumstances? And I think you're saying to us to look at, I think it's probably a combination of ED6, which is the Lambert Smith Hampton report, paper HO 15, in terms of other, I think you just got sort of presented as are there the exceptional circumstances. Was it considered as part of the housing needs assessment work in 2022?
It wasn't directly, no. So the housing needs assessment work in 2022 was obviously based on the standard method, because that's the approach that the council is using. Obviously, this was almost secondary work outside of that, just to test whether there was an alternative, albeit the conclusion being there wasn't.
Thank you. And in terms of, you say, Mr. Brewer, and obviously I've read it as part of the council's case, that if you go down an alternative route to kind of calculate or derive housing need, as you say, you might have to look at kind of things like market signals. I don't think I've read anywhere in the council's evidence that you go so far as to say that if you do that, you would definitely get to a point that's higher than the standard method figure, that there's a likelihood or a probability. I think you've identified in the scale of kind of past under delivery reasonably significant, around about 140 dwellings per annum, but you don't come to a definitive kind of figure that say, well, if you apply a different methodology, you would definitely be higher than the standard method.
No, that's correct, and say we didn't do that exercise in full because one of the reasons we did the additional demographic report for LSH was just to almost explore whether there was that potential, and the conclusion was there wasn't. So we didn't go down the full, effectively running that case as well as the starting point. And I think just I'll come back to that point that the council is using the standard method as the starting point. It's housing need. That's what we're advised to do by the MPPF. And that position we're taking.
We ask at MIQ 2.8 as part of the submissions that we've had on the plan. It would seem to us that the most detailed and sort of one that kind of contained sort of the most comprehensive report was from Mr. Bob Seeley, and we asked the question whether that's the kind of the primary evidence that has been produced, or material. I think it dates back to September 2020, whether that's the kind of principal evidence that's seems to be the main evidence that's before us. I appreciate others adopt the same sort of outcome and advocate for a similar approach, but in terms of the kind of the technical, to a degree, the kind of technical analysis or rationale for that approach, is that effectively the main sort of evidence we have before us, or are we inadvertently overlooking something that's we haven't yet come across?
No, you're absolutely correct. That is the main piece of evidence that's in front of us and that's been submitted to us through the plan making process. And I think we've always been very firm in opposition that this is a detailed and complex subject, and it has to be backed up by evidence. So it's easy to say we should do exceptional circumstances, but actually what evidence backs that up, and that's the key point here. And correct, the evidence in front of us is that, and again, even that evidence, as I think we flagged in our response to 2.8. Suggests actually the housing requirement in that piece of evidence was at 479. So obviously the IPS is at 453. So I guess that I'll leave that hanging.
I think it's fair to say that we've seen that evidence as being more a critique of the standard method and suggestions that there are flaws in the approach taken by the standard method, rather than actually demonstrating by reference to demographic, market signals and under delivery a truly robust alternative that you could prefer to the standard method. So we set that out in the exceptional circumstances paper, as well as in our response to your MIQs.
Thank you. And from the council's perspective, I mean, I think I probably know the answer, but I'll ask it anyway, because it's, I think, follow up to our MIQ 2.9. I mean, is there a reasonable alternative to the standard method, or is the council's position, no, the body of evidence in ED6, HO15, your view would be it's not a reasonable alternative to look at or test and compare against the standard method?
Yeah, that's correct. We've got nothing in front of us that suggests there would be a reasonable alternative to the standard method.
Thank you. I'll bring others in on how the housing need. I'll probably hear first from Councillor Jarman, because I think from reading your representations, if I understand them or interpret them correctly, I think you would advocate there are exceptional circumstances to adopt a lower starting point in terms of the housing need that's for the island. Is that correct?
Yes, so it's necessary to go back a little bit further than the conversation so far. The original analysis that was done on demographics on the island was quite extensive. The whole purpose of that was to give a much more accurate impression of what the housing need was at the time, and more importantly, going forwards, not only in the short term, but in the medium and long term as well. Those were substantial pieces of analysis that were done by a team and submitted into government with extensive government discussions led by the MP at the time, Bob Seeley. There was discussion at the council about that process, and it was not supported other than by a growing number of members who were concerned that the standard method ignored the growing body of evidence that that analysis was producing. And it was quite extensive. I think you've got the paper that Bob Seeley presented at the end. I know that he's offered to provide all of the background analysis to that as well. And we did rely on that in quite a number of submissions to the council. At the time, the NPPF had not been changed. So the version that we're using today, which you've quoted, includes that phrase of exceptional circumstances. And the early discussions at the planning committee and wider within the council were to anticipate that change of the NPPF coming through. And the view was taken that to make a decision on something with such long-term ramifications to the island, knowing or believing that that change was imminent, was inappropriate. And that's why the earlier versions of the plan were rejected by the council. When that finally came out, many were very happy with that expression. There was clarity sought from the government of the wording a couple of times, and it was made very clear by civil servants that they could not name the Isle of Wight specifically, but needed to include it as a general provision in a broad national document. So we accepted that, but they also made it very, very clear in the wording that it related specifically to the Isle of Wight. There was no attempt or belief that it would ever represent anybody else. And in the press and in Bob Seeley's expressions and in the conversations at the council, that clarity was brought forward repeatedly. So we knew what it pertained to. We knew the benefits that it would afford to the island, and we had a substantial evidence base to back it up. During the process going through into 22 then, a number of members sought to bring forward that evidence base into council meetings. And as you'll see on page 14 of my submission, those moves were heavily frustrated. Many of us were quite put out by that, And in the end, the only recourse we have to get it in front of the committee members was to distribute it privately to the committee without it coming out as official committee papers. But we did that. It did get out to the members and we gained their support. And the level of concern from that growing evidence base promulgated quite widely within the council. Having sought to do that, we knew that we needed to push that even further with more up-to-date evidence. And we sought to bring in, at that point, the results of the ONS 2021 data. We were advised that that was not appropriate and that we had to rely on 2014 data as per the standard calculations. We provided further evidence, knowing what the 2021 data showed, because it was ONS data, and that every other part of the council was quickly adopting that, whether it was social services or other government bodies like the DWP, and it was quoted in all of the government literature at the time in forward planning. But for some reason, the resistance about using that 2021 data persisted. It showed that the extrapolated data from 2011 to 2014 was significantly in error. There was a very wide divergence. And if that extrapolated error was continued through to 2021, it led to an even bigger error. Obviously, the lines departing in a straight. So to pull that back into line with what the real data was quite important. And that was a core element of the evidence base that was being submitted. It meant, for example, that we were able to demonstrate that the population increase over those 10 years was nowhere like had been predicted. It was, in effect, the fact that we had just a very small increase in population, 2,500, in fact, as a net differential. But that going forward, based on the further evidence that had come out in Bob Seeley's paper, because the birth rate was falling quite rapidly and the death rate was remaining quite constant, the projection into the future was not that the population would continue to grow, but that there was a high probability within that 95% quartile that the population would actually reduce. Notwithstanding that, we accepted what the ONS data was, 2,500 increase over a 10-year period. That roughly equates to about 100 and so households, just over 100 households on the calculation that was used. And we sought to use that as a figure to show that exceptional circumstances was a real possibility, that there was a solid case to be made for it, that those actual figures were already being used by other parts of the council and by other government organisations, and to leverage that facility to quite radically show a departure from the standard model, not a relatively minor change from 700 to 450, but a more radical change, perhaps below 200, and at the same time to try and refocus the housing need against that changing demographic. And there was a big change in demographic. We have a very aged population. It continues to age on average. The birth rate continues to fall. I don't think even people from the mainland can be immune to the recent conversations about the need for quite substantial school closures on the Isle of Wight now and potentially in the future to rebalance that number. And if that cliff edge of falling birth rate continues, which seems likely, and if the death rate remains constant as it is, then all we would see is that housing need continuing to change. If I look, for example, at the number of properties a year ago when we last made that case that were for sale on the island, I think we used prime location, it was about 1,200. We've now got about 1,500 for sale, and driving around the island, one can't be immune to the number of for sale signs which are popping up quite readily. So there is not a housing supply problem. What there is a housing affordability problem on the island and a right sizing of the type of accommodation which people need. We also brought forward further evidence base from the housing register, and we had discussions with officers about the housing register. It is a self-registration scheme. The details on it are not verified by the Isle of Wight Council. They're only verified later by the housing associations when they come to allocate properties. And as of this morning, in category 1, which are largely homeless people, in some cases rough sleeping, we have on the island 5. If I look at the next category, which are people in largely in temporary accommodation with significant needs, we've got about 250 people. There are, of course, lots of other people on the housing register who are in wrong-sized accommodation or wrong-placed accommodation. They would like to be somewhere else on the island, and their needs obviously need to be addressed, perhaps by swapping or other mechanisms. But the actual housing need from those categories on the housing register is remarkably small. Each one of them is a tragedy and needs to be addressed, but they will only be addressed by matching that specific need against delivery. And a lot of those are not looking for 3 or 4 bedroom properties, they're looking for single bedroom properties. So the evidence base was extensive. It was continually updated, continually brought forward. We believe there was a very, very solid case for exceptional circumstances, and many of us still do, despite the resistance to that model and despite what to many seemed an overzealous attempt to discredit that process and in many cases to block those papers. And we were successful in circumventing those blocks and bringing them forwards. But obviously, as personally distributed documents, they don't carry the same weight as official papers to committees.
Thank you, Councillor Jarman. And obviously, documents can and could be submitted into this examination process, which I think is why I was referring to the material that have been provided by or attached to Bob Seeley's representation. So he has provided that into the examination process. I think prompted my thoughts. You know, is that where we're going to kind of focus our key attention? And obviously, you've referred to that. So if I summarise your position, then, Councillor Jarman, it's your concerns around using the 2014 household projections as the basis. You think they're going to overestimate the actual demographically driven need on the island. Do you arrive at a conclusion or a concluding figure? I think I recall from Bob Seeley's work, was it around about 350 dwellings per annum, or was it lower than that?
So in 2020, the idea was it was between 350. As the 2021 data came out, and as the birth rate data continued to fall, and we continued to model those, the additional works that were presented to the committees showed an extrapolation of that 2,500 growth over 10 years, i.e. 250 per year, in terms of what that need was, added to the housing list in the top 2 priorities, noting the nearly 3,000 extant permissions which already exist on the island. And I think it was 65 from memory, hectares of brownfield land. I'm trying to remember the page in the document now, and I see a number 65 in my mind. It may have been around that, but it certainly wasn't far off. And the desire to take all the parcels of Isle of Wight Council land, which the recent full council agreed to do, and reserve those for priority social rent housing. What we saw was a picture which showed that we have extensive undelivered properties. We have a declining potential demand. And when we modeled that, again, those are in the papers which went to the planning committee and others, and I'm happy to add those to you if you'd like, together with the evidence base from Bob Seeley's work. I can arrange for those to be uploaded as well. We came out with a range of modelling figures, and the range of modelling figures, adding in the 2021 data, gave us a figure of anything between 70 and 210 per year, depending on how we modelled that calculation. Now that's quite different from the 300 to 350, but of course has the benefit of the 2021 data, which was a radical departure from what was expected by anybody. And it builds in the declining birth rate, which is an unfortunate consequence in many ways of our demographics. It's human physiology that with an increasingly aged population, there are less families of childbearing age, and therefore that decline is expected to continue quite sharply. But I'll happily arrange for the evidence base and those submissions to the planning committee and full council to be added to the site.
That's well, I appreciate the offer, Councillor Jarman. I think because of where we are in the process, I think that was why I was asking the council earlier, what is there that's, just to make sure in terms of what's already in the examination process, in addition to the Bob Seeley material that we've already received, because everything should really have been provided either through the Regulation 19 representations back in summer last year, or the opportunity through statements recently in January, February of this year. So I think it's, unfortunately, I think we're going to sort of say it's going to be sort of too late now to kind of be submitting further and new kind of technical material to us, unless on reflection it's something that we specifically want and will request for, and obviously invite the council to give a view. But at this stage, we're going to rely on what's already been provided into the examination. So I appreciate there's things beneath, the Bob Seeley report, if I can call it, use it in those terms. So appreciate the offer, but I think at this moment we're going to sort of draw a line on what's already in front of us.
I'll leave that at your discretion, obviously. If there is further detail that you want, please request it.
Yep.
It was available to the council for them in the evidence base. Whether they chose not to add that to their submission, given it was documents before full council and before the planning committee, that was their discretion as well. But the evidence is there and it's very clear, and largely it comes from the ONS, which is obviously a nationally recognised body. It's not our evidence in a way. We're simply an agent for its portrayal.
Thank you for that. I'm going to hear from other people who I think want to come in on this issue. So thank you for that, Councillor Jarman. Also got your Regulation 19. Before I do, because I think probably I'm going to hear, I don't think I'm going to hear other submissions that are going to echo or align, unfortunately, with your view, Councillor Jarman. I don't know if just give the council the opportunity if there's anything they want to pick up from what I've just been told. Obviously, I've got Councillor Jarman's Regulation 19 statement is referred to, Bob Seeley. I call it the Bob Seeley paper. If there's anything further the council wishes to pick up.
There's lots I could say, but I'll probably make two very brief points. I think one is that obviously the full council made the decision to publish and submit the version of the plan that's in front of us today. So that decision was made. And secondly, any evidence submitted to the plan making process will have been fully assessed and looked at, and such evidence wasn't submitted to the plan making process. So I'll leave it there.
So just to add the reference, the 2021 census data was considered by a council, and that Lambert Smith Hampton report refers to the 2021 census data and expresses the views of those consultants as to why that didn't materially change the position based derived from the standard method, etc. So it's not that there was something new added that wasn't considered. It's all been considered. Obviously, views may differ as to what implications you draw from it, but it wouldn't be right to say that there was something there that the council simply was unaware of or didn't take into account.
Thank you for that. So if I can bring in others then on the issue of housing need as a separate issue to the actual amount of housing the plan should provide. So if I start with Mr. Long, then Mr. Gentleman, and then Mr. Beverley, please.
Thank you, sir. I suppose the interrelationship with matter 2 is, where, we'll probably touch on things in a bit more detail under matter 2, but just to kind of add some context against Councillor Jarman's comments and kind of the evolution of the ex-MP Bob Seeley being at the coalface. I think we have to realise plan making is a positive one and it's forward thinking. And so kind of looking at evidence base via the MP, which I would say even as a theme through representation is all about resisting development. If we're looking at a forward plan thinking approach that overcomes the island needs, you can't base evidence on something that is based on it's perpetuating problems. We need to forecast ourselves out of resolving the problems and leading to a place where we are positively living and working. The evidence base submitted by Mr. Seeley is just dealing with some very naive core localized issues rather than perpetuating itself forward. And partly that's where Mr. Seeley came from in relation to his along with his Tory backbenchers to establish the revision in NPPF 2023. We do have an ageing demographic. We export our youth by the drove. Yes, we can perpetuate that problem if we agree with Mr. Seeley's evidence, but I don't think that's the role of the plan making process in its forward thinking. And the Lambert Smith Hampson report is well versed in actually correlating with previous council's advice about the standard methodology. Arguably, if you just look at the affordable housing needs, stripping out other needs, I don't have it in front of me, sir, but it was talking about over 600 affordable homes per annum. And that would address some of the need. So I don't think the council's rationale to use the standard methodology is wrong, and arguably against exceptional circumstances, it could be more. I'm not here to argue that case. I think the standard methodology is correct. We can have debate about matter 2, but I think the evidence that Mr. Seeley's brought forward should be treated with extreme caution as to what kind of island we want to be, whether it's in the next 13 years, 15 years or so on. We have to break its cycle of the problems that are clearly identified in the plan.
Thank you. Mr. Gentleman next, please.
Thanks very much. Just to echo some of David's comments first off, this should be a positive and forward-looking document. To consider that we've got a need figure in front of us and then look to a lesser number is just completely illogical. I'd also refer to a meeting that I had with Bob Seeley when he was first elected. I went to see him in London to discuss the then housing development for 500 homes on the Isle of Wight. He was very clearly anti any development on the Isle of Wight, and in fact alluded that his objective was to stifle development, to put up house prices, to stop inward migration to the Isle of Wight. Inward migration to the Isle of Wight is something that happens. We are a beautiful south coast location and we are popular with retirees. Now, we can't pull up the drawbridge to that. That is a factor. To not deal with that factor and not supply enough homes just creates a further issue, kicking it down the road, exacerbating the undersupply, exacerbating the affordability. And affordability then knocks on to the affordability of all affordable housing. And if we look at the affordable housing figures that are needed at the moment, continued undersupply of our housing on the Isle of Wight will extend that number, because like any market, if you have 10 newspapers and you've got 12 people that want to buy a newspaper, the price goes up. The fact is we are not building and delivering enough houses, and to look at a plan for our island that should be a positive document and to suggest for 1 minute that we shouldn't be planning for that number is just wrong. Thank you.
Mr. Beverley, please.
Yeah, no, thank you. And obviously echo what Mr. Long and what Mr. Gentleman have just said. I think it's obviously important when we look at, like, in particular, the difference between the two censuses. There's issues related to during that time, 2011 till 21, we've not had an up-to-date local plan. We've not had new housing allocations. The market hasn't really been given the chance to deliver. So clearly that some of the demographic, and it's within the council's evidence, some of the demographic issues of younger people, and I believe representatives around the table yesterday said their own family experience was the young people in their family were looking to leave. It's difficult because it's this conflation between requirement and need, but clearly it's not within a vacuum, and the implications of a lack of house building could have forced some of those issues. And just kind of a second point, given the council's position is it accepts the standard method, which I agree with, and obviously this is an argument we'll come on to in relation to the housing requirement and the difference between the two. It would have made the council's life a lot easier to adopt a more negative argument in relation to need, but that's not where their evidence has led them to. The council accept the need as what it is, but it's an issue of delivery. But it would have made the council's life a lot easier if their evidence had taken them that way. So I think it's just relative to point that out.
Thank you, Mr. Beverley. That's prompted Mr. Beraint to come in on something.
It's just very brief comments there, and I think it is important to recognise that it's for the council to choose whether it wants to look at those exceptional circumstances and may, and I think that's reiterating the point Mr. Bedford made earlier. The council have chosen to look at it and have an extensive evidence base which suggests that the standard method is a reasonable way forward. What we don't have before is any evidence from anyone else in terms of providing that, not before us in terms of the examination, as you've rightly pointed out, sir, and I think that's the difficult position for all of us. We're being told this, but that evidence is not here. It's not here for us to challenge. It's not here for us to consider. It's not here for the council to consider, and that is the key point to take from this. I think what we do have is Mr. Seeley's report. I think that there's fundamental flaws. One of them just being that it does not take any account of affordability adjustment within its calculations, which is a significant flaw within that. We've had affordability adjustments have been a key part of assessing housing needs from 2012. It was part of objectively assessed needs, and it's been part of the standard method. So I think, again, that's just one failing in terms of the consideration. And the affordability issue, I think, as we've heard and we can see in the evidence, is significant, as well as the affordable housing need, which can only really be addressed by ensuring that there is a sufficient supply of land coming forward to deliver both market and affordable housing, and that's fundamentally coming to the next point, sir. But it's just a brilliant overview and of what's being said. Thank you.
Thank you. Is everyone happy they've said what they want to say in relation to housing need? I'll come back to Councillor Jarman. Actually, Mr. Jarman, if I can hear from. No, actually, I'll take it in reverse order because, Mr. Gentleman, you may follow on consistently with what I've kind of heard from the recent round of contributions, and then I think I'll give the opportunity to Councillor Jarman if he wants to rebut or take a different view. So I'll hear from Mr. Gentleman first, and then I'll come to Councillor Jarman, and then I'll hear from the council, and then we'll probably go on to the second issue around housing requirements. Mr. Gentleman.
Thanks very much. Just briefly, a couple of points that were raised in discussion, and I appreciate these coming to the next matter. So I'll just cover these very briefly. But when we look at historic supply figures and try and bring those into reference, we've got to look at those on the understanding that we've had no clear land allocation since the unitary development plan. So that's prevented the confidence for developers to invest and given us the confidence to take planning applications forward. That is really, really, really serious. The second thing is that there was mention of undelivered permissions. Undelivered permissions are a national issue. They're not an Isle of Wight centric issue. That work was proven in the Three Dragons report that supplements these documents. I think the standard rate is somewhere around about 30% fallout from permissions granted to never delivered for many reasons. But that is a national position, and I will come back to the position fallout later, but we need to be accounting for permissions that are going to fall out. We did yesterday, interestingly, touch on in employment, that when we were looking at employment areas, the council acknowledged clearly that we should be over allocating over their specific number because of fallout and because of sites that are never delivered. That is completely the same within housing delivery. It is a national phenomenon. There are reports that supplement this with it. So to look at permissions that remain undelivered and band a figure in isolation without considering the content of that report and the national picture is just not correct. It's really important that we focus on issues that are island-based, not that are a national phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Jarman, please.
I certainly agree with the last part of the statement that we should concentrate on things which are island-based, not the national picture. And whether there are extant permissions in the north of England is of no consequence to here. I'm concerned with the extant permissions on the island. I would refer you just to page 14 of my submission, which has quite copious amounts of data contained within it in terms of the facts and figures, and the source of those are quoted in almost every case.
For that, if I can just come back to the council, I've asked the council at the start of this in terms of their evidence and the approach that they've taken. Is there anything further, Mr. Brewer, that you wish to say in response to those submissions I've just heard, recent run round the table?
No, I think say our position is well put forward in terms of what we're doing with this plan in relation to housing need, using the standard method as starting point, and we have nothing further to add.
And in terms of the standard method, the latest outputs from March of last year, we're probably on the cusp of new affordability ratios very shortly, but the figure was it 703?
Yeah.
I'm going to move on because we probably want to spend quite a bit of time on this next item. It's matter 2, issue 3, and it's establishing a housing requirement. It's probably going to take us all the way through to lunch, no doubt. We will have a break mid-morning adjournment, you'll be pleased to hear. But I'd like to turn again first to the council under matter 2A of our agenda in terms of the soundness of the proposed housing requirement. Obviously, this is separate to housing need. It's a lower figure of 453 dwellings per annum. And it's really understanding through really our questions MIQ 2.10 and to a degree 2.12 in terms of the soundness of the proposed housing requirements, the principle of an approach that's based really on the market capacity to deliver, whether against the tests of soundness, whether that's justified, and in particular, whether it's positively prepared in terms of this balance of being aspirational, but also deliverable. And whether we'll come, I think that then opens a whole kind of Pandora's box of kind of other issues as to why potentially a market capacity derived housing requirement could be justified or not for specific reasons, which we've hopefully set out in some sort of reasonable order in our agenda. But I'd like to hear first from the council really in terms of how they've arrived at the 453 dwellings per annum figure. Just, I think, really for your opening salvo, Mr. Brewer, on why you think that's a justified and sound approach to take for the island, please.
Thank you, sir. And yeah, absolutely. Pandora's box is probably a very apt description. And I think Mr. Beverley as well touched on hit the nail on the head very much so, is that we probably could have taken an easier route, but we are where we are. And I think in some ways that and no doubt the conversations we'll have over the rest of the morning is going to probably just crystallise some of the challenges that we've had as a plan makers in trying to effectively try and position ourselves in what ultimately has to be plan-led development. And I think a big factor in the conversations that through this morning that we need to always keep in the back of our minds is the housing delivery test. And rightly or wrongly, the local planning authority is judged on the number of houses that get built. And to maintain plan-led development, we have to build over 75% of whatever the housing requirement is in the plan. Now, at the moment, in terms of the standard method, and historically, we've got nowhere near that, and we failed that housing delivery test. So one of the I guess key factors for us as a plan maker was to consider we need a new plan, we want to update the plan, but that has to maintain plan development. And so by setting a housing requirement too high, then obviously we would very quickly or may not even get to that plan-led development place. So we kind of looked at basically some of the reports that we had done, some of the evidence we collected through the Three Dragons and University of Portsmouth reports, which kind of set out a number of different barriers and constraints, which we'll come on to, no doubt, through the discussion this morning around kind of developing on the island. Some unique to the island, others not, but all kind of coming together and playing a role in kind of, I guess, potentially suppressing the rate of delivery on the island. And so to try and look at where we could go with that, we thought we'd look back over the last 20 years, all the plan periods within those 20 years. We weren't selective. We didn't kind of pick and choose and pick some out and put some in. We just went back the whole 20 years and thought that that approach provided some empirical evidence for us in terms of what the island could deliver. It also covered a number of different plan periods. It covered a number of different economic market conditions. It covered a number of different local plan positions. And we've heard yesterday, and no doubt we're here today, around the UDP and the allocations. And so obviously that is within that period of kind of evidence that we've looked at. And we tried to then use that to effectively look at what that realistic, but potentially still challenging housing requirement could be. And that's where we arrived at the 453, which is set out in our paper, evidence paper A and table 2 in that. So that's how we arrived at that. And from our perspective, that's kind of that's the only empirical evidence we've got to go on. We've got these issues that we'll no doubt talk through this morning in terms of the capacity of the market to deliver houses. But I think, again, I'll come back to the point I made at the start, that to maintain plan-led development, local planning authority has to get at least 75% of its housing requirement built each year, every year. And so, when you look at that evidence back across delivery on the island, and we're going back 20 years and all those different things that we've picked up in that 20-year period, that there is that kind of average, I won't say ceiling, so I think it's the wrong word. There is that kind of almost sweet spot of delivery on the island of in and around 450 to 500 a year, which is obviously where we've ended up with our housing requirement. So that's the position we've taken, and probably Mr. Bedford wants to add anything on that before we open up.
So only to draw obviously attention to all of our evidence-based papers, which set out in considerable detail the statistical analysis. And I don't think anybody, with I think possibly the one exception of the HBF reference to what happens if you, as it were, fine-tune whether penny feathers is included as a commitment or not, depending on its status at the time that you do the work. With that exception, I don't think anybody's actually presented any contrary empirical data. And in relation to that, we've responded to Mr. Berron's calculations in our own MIQ response. So you've got that. But so the data doesn't seem to be in dispute. It's just the interpretation as to what, as it were, flows from that data. So that's a main point I think we would want to emphasize. And then secondly, there does come the point as to the emphasis in the MPPF. Clearly, this is plan making, and we have taken very much that paragraph 15 together with paragraph 16 set the core objectives. The planning system should be genuinely plan-led, and in paragraph 16b, prepared positively in a way that is aspirational but deliverable. And obviously, it's not, as it were, suggesting that you should aspire beyond what you can realistically achieve. And so those are, as it were, the things that we think the evidence leads us to, the conclusions. And I think it's probably just a final point on this in terms of opening position is to emphasize that the empirical data, we've not taken, as it were, a narrow or a short snapshot of looking at matters. We have looked at the past trends over lengthy periods, over a 20-year period and then 15-year periods within that, and 5-year periods within that. And it's all saying the same thing, in terms of the realistic levels of delivery that can be sustained over a serious period of time. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, we'll come on to this, and I'm sure others have got a view. I mean, and it is part of the agenda, but I think just to to make it clear to the room, obviously, when we're looking at past trends, we've got to kind of also be aware of what may have impacted on those past trends and whether it's reasonable to kind of be extrapolating potentially those forward. I appreciate the council's done a lot of work in terms of the technical paper, and I'm sure when you're looking at or inviting us to consider kind of aspiration versus realism, you probably want to point us to table 3 of paper A, where I think you've kind of looked at kind of various scenarios and where the 453 sits against that. We'll probably undoubtedly come on to some alternatives, but I take the general point. I think other than the standard method, I don't think anybody's articulating a specific kind of empirically driven alternative figure. I think there's probably a concept, not an entire consensus around the room, but probably most people think the figure should be higher. Undoubtedly, some people will say it should be the standard method figure. But that's something we'll obviously have to grapple with. But as we said yesterday, we obviously start from the position that the council itself considers it submitted a sound plan, and the 453 dwelling requirement, in the council's opinion, is a sound position. In terms of, I think, Mr. Brewer, you alluded to it in terms of the council's evidence base, and just trying to again a further layer to help our understanding of the 453 figure and potentially why that's kind of I think you describe it as the plan describes it an island realistic figure requirement. Why particularly this, what the particular kind of constraints are. Obviously, there are various evidence bases that kind of, or documents that kind of indicate various potential kind of barriers to delivery. I don't know if any of those can be weighted in any way, or whether they just cumulatively come together and create a particular issue for the island, or whether some bite kind of more than others.
I don't think necessarily there's a weighting to them. I think they all play a role, and they'll probably all play a role at different times through the development journey and the period of time we're looking at. And I think that's why we tried to make sure our kind of period of looking back at historic delivery was long enough to make sure that all of those different barriers that were played out through the evidence papers that we did effectively would at some point have been picked up or not in that time period. And I think there isn't, and I think again, some of the conclusions in our papers, there isn't necessarily one thing which is a barrier that can just be taken away that will effectively then allow much higher delivery rates to come forward on the island than we've seen over the past 20 years. And I think that's part of the challenge. If there was, it would be nice and easy. We could just solve it and take that barrier away, but there isn't. And I think that's one of the challenges we've got, and we'll no doubt come into some of those in a bit more detail when we're thinking about previous allocations through local plans and the positive impact that could have on housing supply, development finance. Again, a key point, labour supply. The availability and the amount of labour to build houses on the island, number of contractors who build at scale on the island. All of these things form part of the jigsaw puzzle. And it's a challenge for a local plan to try and address all of those. So again, I come back to the point that what we're trying to do here is ensure and maintain plan-led development. And I think, as you rightly said, sir, in terms of the potential consensus in the room, it's the council's position is 453, and the other position is the standard method. But again, I guess 75% of the standard method is 528 homes a year. I don't have any evidence in front of me that gives me the comfort and the certainty that the next 3 years will deliver 528 homes a year straight away. And that's part of the challenge. If we don't do that, we immediately don't have plan-led development, and that again is the kind of always in the back of our minds when we're thinking about this.
Before I open it up to others, can I just perhaps briefly with the council, maybe kind of just establish whether there are some kind of agreed kind of factors, starting with the development plan. Is it correct that the last adopted development plan that made site allocations was the unitary development plan?
For residential, that's correct, yes. So the UDP in 2001, I think it was, and that rolled over a number of allocations from the previous unitary development plan as well. And again, we can get in some of the detail later in terms of some number of those sites that still haven't come forward.
And it was referred to yesterday, so the 2012, there was the core strategy, as part of the core strategy examination process, pre-MP, pre the National Planning Policy Framework, anticipated or was predicated on the basis that there would be area action plans. Was that for specific part, well, by its very definition, it will be for specific parts of the island, but to specific, was a specific function of those area action plans to allocate sites?
Yes, so that before my time at the Isle of Wight Council, but yes, that was the purpose of the AOPs, was to effectively take out some of that allocation work which the core strategy didn't do. However, it probably is just worth flagging the permissive policy approach in SP1 of the core strategy, where effectively the principle of residential development land on land immediately adjacent to the settlement boundaries is acceptable, and that's been the case since 2012, since that plan was adopted.
Sorry, Mr. Bedford.
So it's just on that particular point, there was some reference made yesterday, and indeed there has been reference made in some of the written representations before you, to what the core strategy inspector had said about the AAPs. That was Mr. Hetherington. And I'm conscious that nobody, I think, has actually provided you either with a full extract of what he said in his report, or the report as a whole. But it's fair to say, because obviously we've seen it, he not only refers to the AAP point, he also refers to the point Mr. Brewer has just mentioned about the permissive approach to development outside of settlement boundaries. And both of those are part of the jigsaw. But I'm just conscious that, in a sense, various people saying things about it is not really a substitute to, would you like an extract or the report? It's actually a relatively short report, so that you can actually see the context of the last inspector's consideration of that issue.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, I think the 2012 core strategy is in as an examination document, so I can see the policy framework there. I'll reflect on that offer, whether we need to see the complete report. The halcyon days of being able to write shorter reports. Yep, sounds very, yeah, very good. But yeah, I'll reflect on that offer, Mr. Bedford. Thank you. And then just finally from the council, is kind of just whether we can kind of agree some kind of sort of factual baseline in terms of kind of last or most recent kind of national house builder activity on the island. I think I've been referred to two particular sites, one in Newport and one in Cowes. Is that from the council's perspective the kind of the last or the most recent sort of two national house builder sites?
It is, yes, and they've both now built out over the last kind of 12 months, I think, or so. Yeah. And as far as we're aware, there's no other activity on the island at present.
Okay, thank you for that. I will hear from others. Probably we've done that, we'll probably have a mid-morning adjournment because we're on a slightly different time frame today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go round from Mr. Beverley through to Mr. Gentleman, and it's really on this kind of first sort of substantive point of my agenda about the soundness of the proposed housing requirement of 453. So Mr. Beverley first, please.
Yeah, I think just on that point, and I appreciate we're probably going to say similar things, so I'll keep my first point brief and make others if they don't come up. But I suppose it's the importance of allocations and the difference of up-to-date allocations. I think a really good piece of evidence or indication of the difference of allocations in terms of what we expect or what the council expect allocations to do is the council's 4-year housing land supply report of last year, which is still sounds a bit weird, but it was a nuance of the 2023 MPPF. But yeah, the 4-year housing land supply report, that projected with some of the draft allocations coming on stream, that projected an average delivery of in excess of 700 dwellings per annum. So certainly the council in April of last year considered that with housing allocations coming on stream, the council could, the delivery could be uplifted. And I think this will be a recurring theme. It is that lack of up-to-date allocations, given the specific challenges of the Isle of Wight. And also it's the composition of the land supply. You know, even on the mainland, a lot of the real big PLC house builders now won't touch sites less than 300 dwellings. It just doesn't stack up for them on the mainland. That unfortunately will obviously clearly be the case on the Isle of Wight as well. So, and I think that it's the Three Dragons report says there's maybe only 3 sites of over 100 dwellings and 1 site of over 500, and that lack of volume sites that would give confidence to the developer market in terms of establishing the logistics, supply lines, staffing, all those kind of things. That has been a major factor in why the island's delivery has been so hindered in the last certainly 10, 15 years.
Thank you. Ms Goodyear, next please. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to build on a point really that Mr Brewer was making about, you obviously mentioned the housing delivery test, but also paragraph 76B of the MPPF requires at the conclusion of this examination, the plan needs to be able to demonstrate the 5-year supply of specific deliverable sites. So I just thought, I know we're discussing that next week as well, and the importance, I guess, of having a positive plan in place in this plan-led system. And kind of to just reference, obviously the new MPPF, we're not being examined under that criteria now, but it does require in the transition arrangements that this plan will need to be subject to an immediate review. So I think that kind of softens our position a bit, because really it's important, I think, to have something adopted. We haven't had any allocations adopted since 2001, and to try and bring these sites forward, really we need to get a plan in place.
Councillor Jarman next, please.
Thank you, sir. I was just picking up on 2 points here. One was this market capacity to deliver, and the other one was the constraints of delivering on an island. Both of those, of course, are very significant here, and I think everybody appreciates that. But I think it's, or I would suggest that it would be inadvisable to look at them in complete isolation. That to deliver properties on the island requires not only the delivery of those properties, but the infrastructure that goes with them. And what we do have on the island is a greatly acknowledged problem with the infrastructure which would be necessary to support those properties. The key one of those, of course, is, well, in my ward, I'll pull it out very quickly, which is going to be sewage. You know, we do not have a sewage capability. We have massive discharges from my ward and from every place from there to Sandown on the island. The whole of the island suffers from that problem. Southern Water have made it very clear within their infrastructure plan to support future development that they will no longer support, as a policy now, sites which do not separate grey water and sewage water. But even though they acknowledge that most of the sewage network is over capacity at the moment because of that issue, of course, any additional sewage coming into those networks will cause further detrimental discharges to our seaways and to our rivers, etc. To such an extent in my ward that new developments which have come in, connecting into those very limited capacity infrastructures, have caused explosions of sewage on Cornwall Common. I mean, those have been well documented, well videoed, and we've got pictures very frequently now of sewage spewing out onto Cornwall Common from developments upstream of that site, simply because there is not capacity in the network to do it. So my very strong recommendation here would be that we have to have an infrastructure-led initiative in terms of market delivery, not simply looking at how many greenfield sites can we take and deliver new boxes on them. We need to have a full picture of it, and infrastructure is key. The final part of that is that it's not just the effluent coming out of the new developments, it's the basic elements that we have in terms of water supply to them. And it's such a desperate measure as that now got on the island that the current plan, which is out for consultation with Southern Water, is for them to take an extraction of the sewage water from Sandown, put it through a filter and put it back into our water supply as drinking water on the island. So desperate measures here by Southern Water, given their other restrictions, and we cannot ignore those factors. They are major constraints on this island, and until the infrastructure is fixed, I don't think any major development should occur at all. Thank you.
Mr. Long, please.
Thank you, sir. I mean, just picking up on Councillor Jarman's point, I think, you know, we've got to remember that development delivers infrastructure. You know, one doesn't happen without the other. So we have to accept growth to deliver the infrastructure that the island needs to support its needs, if in better words. But I'll park that point for you to consider, sir. Just picking up on Mr. Bedford's comment, my Reg 19 representation did quote the Mr. Hetherington's representation about the APs. I'll just quote what he said. The council's 5-year land supply sees a delivery of some sites that are not presently allocated. Clearly, the prompt preparation of forthcoming AAPs, notably those from the Medina Valley and Ryde, opposed to the local development schemes submission in 2012 and 2013 respectively, will be, and this is the important bit, a significant factor in bringing sites forward to meet both the 5-year requirement and longer term core strategy total. It's quite clear on that. And just following on from that, the council did try to advance with the AEPs in 2014 and weren't successful. And I would say from 2018, the local planning authority, rather than the council as a whole, their hands have been completely tied up in matters that shouldn't concern them, but it's led to them preparing Reg 18, 28 in 2018, 21, bit 22, and now here we are as a consequence of, I'd say, more the struggle to get it through even cabinet approval. It's not for their own doing. They've tried exceptionally hard, and those previous iterations haven't struggled with evidence base to use the standard methodology. They've accepted that position. It's only as I would suggest as a consequence of trying to get a plan approved through a cabinet as an initial stage of Reg 19 that we are where we are. And just in relation to the SP1 point, yes, the plan core strategy did have an allowance for SP1, which is essentially saying land immediately adjacent to the settlement boundary would be appropriate. Just being in the cold face of planning applications from 2012 onwards for some of the larger proposals which are now being built out, there was an extreme struggle to accept the policy position SP1. The first tranche of applications went to appeal because even the head of planning service at the time, not Mr. Bolter, may I say, predecessor 2 was completely resistant to using SP1 as a matter of principle. And it took quite a few years and through inspectorate decisions to get SP1 more embedded into a normal planning system, because we previously had an allocated system through the unitary development plan, which offered the stability of placemaking and where development should go. We then went to a more liberal approach to SP1 as a transitional arrangement, which we're still at, which has created the frustrations that Councillor Jarman is raising, communities not knowing where development should go, and that creates friction between and debate between where development should go and where it shouldn't, and the quantum applied. And within the development industry, we need to de-risk the system and have places where we can grow so businesses can invest, and that is primarily achieved through allocations. And just on the point on the national house builders, it's interesting, through the tranche of allocations made in the unitary development plan, we did have Barratt Homes, Persimmon Homes, David Wilson Homes, and now finally building through that tranche of development. within the end of the cycle of the UDP, they were delivering more than the annual supply of housing because they were big sites that were taking on quantum and they were exceeding the total requirement. That, admittedly, that was the back end of the process, but because of the stability that they were given, they could achieve that and deliver it. And because I fear that if we're using evidence-based because of the perpetual problems of lack of allocations to advance a narrative that we cannot do it, it just doesn't ring true to me that we can't do it because it has been done, but we just haven't had the stability and platform to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Long. Mr. Berrant next, please.
Thank you, sir. I'd echo what Mr. Long has said, and far more eloquent than I think I would say in terms of, and from a local perspective in terms of delivery. I think fundamentally, without the land allocations, you're not going to come forward. There will be, if you plan for 453, you'll deliver 453. Whereas actually, if you look to allocate sites and allocate land to deliver more, there is the potential to deliver those, and you can grow the market in terms of going beyond the short and medium term growth that's set out in the council's evidence, and we see that in I think it's the Matter 7 statements with the new housing trajectory. It shows from 26, 27, 602 moving to 667, 704, 747. So the scale of deliveries there. I think the key question that needs to, or the key challenge is how is that sustained in terms of that delivery? And that's through site allocations. It's through ensuring that there is lower risk to ensure that investment in the local infrastructure, in the capacity of the market to deliver at those rates consistently. And I think that's potentially what we saw in terms of, you know, we can go back to 2001, you know, and the adoption of that. That's a long time ago now. You know, I would say I had more hair. I didn't. I was bald then as well. But I think what you're seeing there from that 2001 to 2010 and 2000, you're looking at a delivery of an average delivery of 670. Granted, it was significantly more towards the end of that period, so that it did drive forward that development. You had the allocations there that provided certainty. Some larger sites, but also you need certainty on those medium-sized and smaller sites as well, especially within a market that's like the Isle of Wight, which is at the moment quite a lot of SME developers within that. But how do you ensure those SME developers grow and do that? You de-risk the market by providing more significant a number of allocations within that can come forward both in the medium term as we're seeing, but then also in the longer term as well alongside strategic sites. So I think it's that balance that's potentially lacking. I think it's also come back in terms of the use of we've never done this, you know. In the past, we've only been able to deliver 453, so we can't in the future. I think you're coming back to paragraph 11 of the NPPF, and which does say you meet needs in full, unless there are obviously there's the footnote 7 requirements, but also 11B within the NPPF, which I should remember. Since I quote it often, I should remember somewhere off the top of my head. But in terms of any adverse impacts of doing so would significantly or demonstrably outweigh the benefits. And I don't think that's not the council's position within that. The council's position is that it's not deliverable, that the market, you know, isn't sufficiently robust to be able to deliver beyond 453. It's not looking back and saying, well, actually, we just can't deliver it because of other reasons, or the impact of that would be so negative. Clearly, the assessment in terms of that there is significant positive benefits in terms of infrastructure, you know, and the council set that out with relation to 453, but you know, there are also those wider benefits in terms of affordable housing, in terms of you know, impacting on delivery and meeting housing needs are significant. And the council obviously say aren't arguing that, so they should be looking at actually how can we deliver that in terms of looking at whether in the short term and making sure the plan is deliverable. Obviously, the council could have looked at something like a step trajectory in terms of ensuring actually how do you build up to that level, in terms of saying actually ensuring that you have a requirement in that early part of the plan that is potentially deliverable, recognising that the council evidence suggests that it has been more difficult to deliver without those allocations, but actually then with those allocations you build up to delivery. So it's those elements that don't seem to have been considered, sir, within this, and so essentially how do you build a market to deliver that number of homes? rather than say, actually, we've only ever delivered this in the past, so we can't go forward. So I think those are the elements that I'd expect in terms of what that pipeline is with regard to it. So I think those are my key concerns in terms of actually what the council have done. Recognise it is more of a challenge, but it's then how do you overcome those challenges rather than say, oh, well, this is all we've done, so we'll just accept that position moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I bring in Mr. Gentleman, because I appreciate you are representing a developer on the island. I mean, part of the council's evidence base in terms of, in various points, in terms of kind of potential barriers, you know, what's potentially accounting for kind of past delivery on the island, I think overlaps with an issue we were kind of discussing yesterday in terms of just physically the island's detachment, getting materials, labour, all these kind of factors to support further higher growth. I think that's been something in our thought process as to the extent that that really is a significant issue that's going to be difficult to kind of overcome, but then leads us to, should we be concluding that, well, 453 is a realistic figure that the island's development sector that's currently based here is a figure that they can realistically deliver based on existing supply chains, labour, etc. Mr. Johnson, you may have a view on that as somebody who's kind of more perhaps at the coalface than others in terms of physically delivering new dwellings on the island. But if others want to come back in on that point about the physical separation of the island and the extent to which that's a barrier inhibiting an uplift from 453. Mr. Gentleman.
Thank you. So I've been building and developing on the island since 2002. So there's a couple of things I'd like to point out about the Isle of Wight. So we've got on the Isle of Wight 2 timber frame manufacturers manufacturing timber frame homes and exporting them successfully to the mainland as a product. That means that the timber frames that we buy here on the Isle of Wight are cheaper than you can buy them on the mainland. We manufacture our own concrete blocks on the island, and I can in fact buy those cheaper here than I can on the mainland. The labour rates on the Isle of Wight are also cheaper than they are just over the water. And as a consequence, my labour rates are cheaper than they would be if I was building in Portsmouth or Southampton. So there are many factors about the Isle of Wight, most of them that I consider to be positive. You know, the Isle of Wight is a beautiful place to live, it's a beautiful place to work, and it's a lovely place to be. But the separation factors here on the Isle of Wight are valuable. They're not something that restrict what we do and how we do it. There are limitations to all things, of course, as there would be if you were building in Portsmouth or Southampton. And we're not the same as those areas, you know, in terms of their economic performance, more akin to perhaps Margate or somewhere like that. But the reality is, do not believe everything you hear about the cost of building over here and the difficulties of it. You only have to go down the road to Sydenham's Timber Engineering and look at what they manufacture there and what they export to the mainland as a product. So that's what I would like to say about building on the Isle of Wight. Capacity and the ability to develop on the island is limited by the confidence to invest. If I want to grow the capacity of my workforce, I'm limited by doing that because I have to have the site of work in front of me. And I have to have the confidence that I can get planning permission and that I know where I'm going to take my workforce to expand them readily. So capacity follows the confidence, and that leads into the segue of the UDP, which we've all discussed and touched on, allocations. So when I started developing homes on the Isle of Wight in 2002, it was a lot simpler. You took the UDP, you looked at the allocated sites within that UDP, and you picked one that you quite like the look of, had a conversation with the landowner. If it didn't work, you had a conversation with the next landowner. But you had a clear track of where you could go and what you could do. And when you were taking a permission forward with an allocated site, there was a clear track that permission should be given. That provided the confidence to invest in that permission and drive it forward with some reasonable pace. Without that confidence, it takes years to get planning. And I can mention many specific planning applications that I've been involved in that have dragged on for years. One particularly that is going to the Court of Appeal in April. So in terms of the ability to develop 453 houses, well, if that is our ceiling, and we look back at historically what we delivered in 2006 and 2007 when we were riding on that UDP and those allocations, and we were hitting the 700 figures then. And if we're looking at the trajectory of housing shown in table 7.1, we're suggesting that in year 3, we can build 735 houses. In year 4, we can build 760 houses. Well, hang on a minute. In year 5, we're winding that down to 608. Why are we doing that? And in years 6 to 10, we're reducing that number again. Well, that doesn't show there's a ceiling, does it? In fact, quite the opposite. It's suggesting that if we plan for allocations effectively, we can build back at that number that we've done previously by giving developers the confidence to invest. I think I've covered my points, but I'll probably remember something and come back in a minute. Thank you.
Mr. Beverley next, and I'll come back to the council, and then we'll probably take a mid-morning break. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So just 2 quick points if I may. First is just going to a quite useful reference in the Three Dragons report in relation to PCIS costs. That suggests that build costs on the Isle of Wight are broadly comparable to Hampshire, and therefore that report concludes that it's more of a perception than a reality that build costs. And I think certainly what Mr. Gentleman has just said there actually says there's actually arguments that you could do things cheaper on the island. And I suppose second is just more kind of a general point. This is my first trip to the Isle of Wight, and it's very nice to be here and nice to look around. I've been into Tesco and Lidl, and it's not very exciting part of the island, but the goods in there seemed broadly similar price, you know, so clearly when there is time for companies and particularly larger companies to get supply lines and things in place, it can obviously be done relatively cost effectively. I don't see any reason why that couldn't apply to the volume house builders, subject to sites that attract that type of house builder in terms of composition of supply. And clearly we've heard this morning that historically that was the case and those builders were present on the island.
Thank you. I'll come back to the council if I may. There may be specific points you want to respond to, but just two things in particular I'd like to understand the council's position on. As the council said at the start of discussion of this particular matter around the housing requirement, you've done the empirical evidence, you've looked at what's happened in the past, you've analysed it, looked at different time periods. And over the long-term average, what your position is the 453. Would it be reasonable for us to look at potentially alternative periods within even the council's figures? Does the council recognise some of the figures that have been put to us that if you go back to the core strategy period, average delivery, I think the figure was around about 650 or 648. Conversely, should we be more cautious about recent kind of delivery figures? Because when I look at the council's evidence, annual delivery seems to be declining, particularly if you include particularly the last sort of 5 years, coinciding, I think, Mr. Brewer, with 2018, when you say the presumption started to kind of kick in. Whether if you kind of look at alternative kind of time scenarios within the council's evidence base, that may point to, some might argue, as reasonable alternative kind of figures. That's the first area. If you can remember that bit, I'm going to raise another one whilst I can remember it. And then the second point that's been made by a number of people, and is something we've alighted on in terms of the Matter 7 statement and the revised housing trajectory, there's obviously some significant delivery over the next 5 years at considerably in excess of 453. So we'll come back to that next week in terms of the realism of that. An obvious question, or two obvious questions that arise from that: why can't that be sustained at some shape or form over the plan period? And who is building those 700 houses at this moment in time? Again, why can't that be sustained?
Thank you, sir. And if it's all right with you, I'll pick up the second point first, and then come on to the kind of the statty spreadsheet one afterwards, if that's all right. And I think in some ways, The answer to the second one really for us crystallises the whole point. In terms of and a couple of points I just wanted to make first. So this plan, just so we're all clear, is making allocations. And I don't think anyone doesn't know that, but I just want to make that absolutely clear. This plan is making a number of allocations. It does have large sites in it. There's 3 sites, well, 2 in excess of 500 and 1 near 500. So there are 3 large sites that form part of those allocations. So just kind of talking to some of the points that have been raised so far. We do also have a trigger in the plan in section 10 that if our housing completions were in excess of 453 for 3 consecutive years, we then review that plan numbers. That's already in the plan in terms of that trying to be forward thinking and addressing some of the points raised around, well, if we start slowly and then speed up in terms of completions, what does that mean? So I just want to set those out. In terms of the points that you raised there around the supply and the trajectory, and I guess, a trajectory is only ever as good as the day you put it together, because things change, as we've heard already this morning. Sites will have permission and then not come forward. And I think in some ways what the trajectory demonstrates is there actually is a very strong pipeline at the moment of permitted sites or sites that are in the process of being very close to permitted, and that forms fundamentally the basis of that early supply. When you look at the numbers in detail, I think over 50% of the supply is coming from sites that are already permitted in the next kind of 4 or 5 years. Now, we'd be wrong as a council to ignore those permissions. They're there. We expect them to be delivered. The correspondence we have through planning statements is that those sites will come forward and be delivered. That's why they've put planning application in. But we appreciate, obviously, that doesn't always happen. And I think in some ways the strong pipeline almost kind of supports what we're trying to say here, is that the issue isn't necessarily one of supply. The supply is there, but when you look at the delivery statistics, that they don't necessarily marry up, and I think that's the issue we're trying to try and get our heads around here, certainly from a plan making perspective, is that we could have a very strong supply and pipeline of sites that's in place, but we have had that more recently. And interesting, talk to Mr. Long's point, he's absolutely spot on. When you look at kind of post-core strategy 2012 to kind of 2014, the approval rates of applications, major applications, were kind of 60-70%. Obviously since 2015, and certainly in more recent time, they're way above 90% in most years. So in terms of that, what's the LPA doing? It's granting the permissions, so the supply is there. But for all the reasons we've talked about already, and we'll probably continue to talk about, the delivery rate of those potentially isn't what it would be in other particular areas because of the housing market. And I think that's the where I'll end on that kind of trajectory point, and come into it probably in more detail next week when we look at some of the numbers in detail. And just going back to your first point around numbers and statistics and kind of reasonable alternatives. And again, one of the reasons we went back over 20 years was so we didn't ignore those kind of boom years. And I think Mr. Gentleman referred to them around the kind of 770 and 710 in 2006, 7 and 7, 8. And we didn't want to exclude those because, again, we're trying to look across all different scenarios that have come forward on the island in that time, different plan making scenarios, different economic cycles, and equally the more recent completions, which have been relatively, well, much lower. We didn't want to exclude those either, or just focus on those. It would have been very easy for us to look at the last 10 years and come up with a housing requirement of probably 350, but that would have ignored those circumstances which in the plan we're trying to, at least as a stepping stone, replicate through allocations and providing some of that certainty to the market, but also really conscious, and I go back to the point I made right at the start of the morning, which our predecessors with the UDP didn't have, was the housing delivery test and that planning sanction that applies to the LPA if we don't get to 75% by housing requirement. And again, that's a fundamental part of where we're here, what we're trying to do to ensure that plan-led development continues. So I'll stop there.
Yep, don't let us kind of.
So could I just add, partly this is material that obviously you've already got, but we have set out, particularly in section 7 of paper A, the analysis of delivery rates compared to the position under both the core strategy and also with the allocations of the UDP. And that's all set out in the material before you. And we have, as it were, covered similar points on, I think, page 15 of our response to MIQ 2.15. And so I don't think anybody's actually challenging the statistical information there. And we think it pretty clearly follows from that the presence or absence of allocations does not make a significant difference to the outputs that are being achieved. And they're not, as it were, the magic bullet that certainly some of the representations that are being put to you answers. I mean, we're not saying that allocations don't play a part, and obviously the plan has allocations, but you simply cannot, in a sense, allocate your way into the higher levels of delivery over a sustained period of time. And I say that's the point, again, we've been trying to make. It's not that we're saying that you can't achieve higher rates in individual years or indeed in a succession of years. Not the trajectories that we're putting forward show that. It's what's the long-term achievability of that. So that's, I say, we've provided that analysis. Then the second point, just I noticed that Mr. Long did treat you to the quote from paragraph 16 of Mr. Hetherington's letter on the core strategy, which had referred to the AAPs. And that paragraph 16 does complete the very next sentence, which isn't in Mr. Long's quote, where Mr. Hetherington said, however, a significant degree of additional flexibility is provided by policy SP1 support in principle for development on appropriate land within or immediately adjacent to the defined settlement boundaries of KRAs, SRAs and RSCs. So that was making that point. And related to that, just in terms of the chronology, it is worth observing that in relation to two of what are now allocations proposed in the local plan, that's to say the Pennyfeathers site and the West Acres site, you go back into the history of those sites, both of which have had planning permissions, albeit one is the subject of a legal challenge. But the planning applications for those sites were made at a time when the policy framework was provided by core strategy SP1. Those are not sites which were allocated first and then planning applications came in. Those were sites where the developers were content to bring forward planning applications on sites which were greenfield sites outside of settlement boundaries, because there was a policy framework provided that was permissive of those developments. And so both of those sites have actually come forward through that core strategy route and didn't need, as it were, what is said to be the confidence or the certainty provided by an allocation for the persons responsible for those applications to make the, no doubt, significant decisions to invest in preparing applications and bringing those forward. They've both taken perhaps more time than I think anybody in this room would have wished to come to fruition. But again, it isn't the case that allocations are the silver or magic bullet that solves everything. They play a part, but the picture is much more complicated for the reasons I think we've attempted to explain.
For my benefit, I mean, we'll come on to this thing as part of this afternoon's discussion. It's not the option for this plan to kind of continue to pursue a policy SP1 type approach. I think you've looked at it as part of sustainability appraisal. It's one of the reasonable alternatives, but ultimately it's not. Yep. Okay. I appreciate people may want to come back in on some of these points. We are going to continue to discuss this, but it's just gone 11:15, so I'm going to take now a mid-morning adjournment. I'd like to be back here, please, at 11 o'clock to continue the discussion. Thank you. Okay, it's just gone 11 o'clock, so it's time to resume this plan examination hearing. We'll bring other people in on the discussion where relevant, but I just want to pick up a further matter with the council in terms of their evidence base and kind of the rationale for the 453 dwelling per annum being a sound or reasonable approach. And it was a reference to kind of the non-delivery of the unitary development plan sites, or some of the unitary development plan sites. It's kind of perhaps, I think, from the council's perspective and evidence of you can make allocations but not necessarily come to fruition. I mean, in terms of the scale or the extent of that issue, how significant is it? And should we also bear in mind that obviously nowadays we do have things like strategic housing land availability assessments, so that going forward, hopefully there's stronger predictability about when sites might come forward that perhaps wasn't such in play to such an extent at that time. So the significance of UDP sites not coming forward.
Thank you, sir. And yeah, it's a interesting one. Just bear with me while I adjust my spreadsheet on a couple of occasions. So we look back at the allocations in the UDP that were made, and it's interesting to note that a number of those had rolled over from the previous local plan, 37 of them. And again, I guess the point we're trying to look at there is that as Mr. Bedford said earlier, allocations are absolutely part of the way you can improve housing delivery, but not all allocations come forward. As much as we talked about earlier, not all permissions get delivered, and so you know, the fact that some of those allocations came forward from the previous plan into the UDP, and then some of them still haven't been delivered, I guess just crystallises that point to a certain extent around allocations being part of the solution, but not the only solution to that. And I think, you know, when you look at the SHLAR as well, I always caution slightly around the SHLAR and I guess perhaps the misunderstanding within the public that a SHLAR allocates land. It doesn't. It's just a demonstration that land could be available for development at some point in the future. And obviously that's part of the evidence base the council then use when it looks at site selection, which we'll come on to tomorrow and next week as well in terms of that. So I guess in summation on that point, you know, from our perspective, we're not challenging that the supply is there, both through permissions and sites. Again, it comes back to our point around delivery. That's the key point for us, which is obviously how we've arrived at our housing requirements based on delivery, and that's I guess where we're at.
Thank you. So just pick up on that final point, Mr. Brewer. When you say the supply is there, is that for the requirement that's in the plan or an alternative?
I think you can see from the trajectory figures that you know, the supply is there for the requirement in the plan, and in some years we exceed that. As I said earlier, the housing trajectory is very it's kind of about as good as the day you write it, because things change. So there will be years where that trajectory shows in excess of 453. There'll be years below it over the passage of time, which again comes back to our point around looking at that historical delivery patterns. Things will even out. So some of those years where perhaps we've shown that there's the potential for 700 dwellings to come forward, they may not all come forward for different reasons that affect planning permissions being delivered. They may then fall into the next couple of years and on beyond that. So I guess, you know, the point we're trying to make is that the pipeline supply is relatively strong to meet the requirements in the plan, but the delivery is the key point here, and it's making sure that delivery is achievable, because if it isn't, we go back to the point I made right at the start, that we move away from plan-led development, which is the purpose of us going through this process.
Thank you. Does anyone want to come in at this particular point before I go on to other items on the agenda? If I start with Mr. Gentleman, then Mr. Long, then Mr. Beverley.
Thanks very much. So the first thing is that if we're planning for 453 homes, we're not taking account any fallout rate in that. if we're looking at the Three Dragons evidence, which supported that 30% fall out, and as Mr. Brewer has just discussed, of all the schemes that come forward, not all of them get delivered. If we take that 30% from the 453 homes, that leaves us with 417. So it shows quite clearly that we're not planning effectively to deliver that number. The second thing I wanted to talk about was Mr. Bedford's point on the Westacre application. I was the developer behind Westacre with my former business partner, and I wanted to talk specifically about the difficulties of that and the lack of allocation. We first started pursuing the amalgamation of that site in 2014. It is today, 2025. There is still no consent in place. It has taken an unbelievable amount of money to get us to this point. And still, as I say, there is no consent in place. The first phase of that development was under construction in 2021, and there were 80 homes on that development. And on that development, at that point in time, we were selling 40 homes a year on the open market. We could have, from that site, rolled straight into that next portion of development and continued to deliver. But the difficulties within our planning system and the complications around that site, not least because it wasn't allocated, have caused extreme difficulties in the delivery of it. And so to suggest that the lack of allocations have not caused the delivery of sites coming forward is just wrong. I'm sure Ms. Goodyear would have something to say on Penny Feathers, which again was a site that was consented, that was fought on a long battle to get consent, and of course had difficulties in the process, as these things often do. But to suggest that lack of allocations did not cause us a problem is wholly incorrect and not right. Thank you.
Mr. Long, please.
Thank you, sir. Just touching on those points, I agree with Mr. Bedford and Mr. Brewer. You know, allocations aren't the complete silver bullet, but they're a good chunk of the solution to it. And I would say SP1 has certainly not been the silver bullet to provide the silver bullet, the right word, but anyway, you know what I mean. SP1 hasn't been that. It's been quite a controversial, probably blunt tool to get planning applications over the line, and as a consequence of that, it has understandably created fractions in communities because they're not aware of development going forward. Then they see either through public consultation or planning application going in, which obviously local ward councillors have to represent the communities on the backdrop of not having the stable platform of where the growth is happening. That has led to several issues, I'd say, in determination of planning applications. When first started, from conception to digging first spade, talking about 3 years kind of scenario. Now you can easily see 7 to 8 years without even blinking at that gap, and that's happened in a relatively short period of time because of the uncertainty. And I appreciate that it's not Isle of Wight issue, it's a national picture about the lead-in times. Hey, let's all agree planning has become more complicated in its determination process, but it's certainly helped when allocations are made because it gives the degree of certainty that people aren't there to argue about the principles. And just coming on to that point, you know, it culminated, and I believe it's in evidence that the council had to undertake its own peer review of the problems arising from planning determination process, and that peer review was partly aligned to getting applications through a planning committee process, which we personally struggled with, you know, with nearly some members of the council having 100% refusal records on major applications. And so it just gave the context of quite a very difficult process to get applications through because of the lack of the stability. that has a knock-on consequence about the lead-in times to actually deliver, as Mr. Gentleman said, regarding the Westacre phase 1 stroke going into phase 2, where going back to an earlier comment that Mr. Gentleman made about continuity of supply and labour force and having stability within your business to then roll into the next site. Once you stop that, your labour force isn't going to be continuous, and therefore it leads to perpetual problems about the issues of the constraints that the council have outlined in evidence. I do see allocations as being a part of that jigsaw to manage that risk in all sorts of frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Beverley next, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Just a couple of brief points. Firstly, there's been a few comments about allocations not being the golden bullet and this kind of thing, but I suppose 2 points. We are in a MPPF's quite clear, it's a plan-led system. And the second point is we are moving away from the more permissive core strategy environment, notwithstanding comments about the efficacy of that. Just to go back to one of the kind of the earlier points in relation to, I believe it was Mr. Bedford said that nobody's challenging the data, i.e. what's been delivered on the Isle of Wight in the last 20 years. I think the point is we're not challenging the data, we're challenging the context and the lack of up-to-date plans. I mean, if there was 5-year rolling reviews, allocations that weren't being delivered could have been replaced by more deliverable sites. And essentially, if there were bad allocations that weren't deliverable, you could read different things in that. The council's view is that that's endemic of supply issues in general, where it could be an issue, site-specific issue, but there's been no regular examination and like an attempt to rectify that. And then there was the comment that allocations are kind of not as directly linked to supply, but I think some of the comments earlier were actually from the UDP. That was where we had the highest levels of delivery. And then looking at the council's trajectory and the 4-year housing land supply statement, it's clear that the boon of the new allocations that this plan is making is accelerating us into, 700 plus dwellings per annum delivery. And the reason that falls away later parts of the plan period is actually, again, comes back to this point of the composition of supply, not the ability of the island in general, and going to the earlier points about continuity of workforce and security. It's those bigger sites actually that once they get going will provide consistent supply through into the middle and latter ends of the plan period.
Thank you. I think it was Councillor Jarman next, and then Ms. Goodyear.
Thank you. I'll take your advice on it, but there's been a few references this morning to a particular site near Ryde, which is the subject to an appeal at the moment and is before the court in a matter of a few weeks. I just feel uncomfortable because a number of people in this room are involved in that legal proceedings for it to be mentioned. So before I continue, I'll just invite your response to that.
Okay, I think for this particular session, I don't think we need to get too sort of involved in site-specific details. I mean, I'm aware that site is in the plan. I think it's in one of the appendices. Technically, as a site, it's kind of in the planning pipeline to some degree. I won't get sort of too bogged down in sort of precisely where it is. So I appreciate it is referenced and contained within the document that's before us, but I think we need to steer away from sort of too many sort of site specifics and the kind of the generalities of, I think the point that's being made from various people around the table from the development sector is around sort of, I think from their perspective, the challenges of progressing sites through the planning system on the island, and whether that's a contributory factor and to what extent it's a contributory factor to recent past delivery rates, whether that's the extent to which that should be taken into consideration. So I'll try and steer too much away from the Westacre.
Thanks, sir.
But it's not. No.
Sorry, sir, could I just make a point, because it's a slightly legal point. The fact is that the site has been granted a planning permission by the council. So although I know Mr. Gentleman said it hasn't got a permission, it has a planning permission which is under an outstanding legal challenge. The approach that is conventionally taken in, as it were, administrative proceedings like this is that decision makers are entitled to assume that an administrative decision that has been made, whether it's by central government or by local government, is valid unless and until it is quashed by the courts. And that would apply to a planning permission as much as it would apply to any other administrative decision, because otherwise it becomes very difficult for decision makers to do things, because clearly it's no part of anybody's job here to speculate on the outcome of legal proceedings, because clearly they are matters for the courts, not for this thing. So all that one can say is that as a matter of fact, there is a planning permission, and as a matter of fact, there is an outstanding legal challenge, but one doesn't really and shouldn't really go beyond that. But that, I don't think, means that it is something that, in a sense, that one shouldn't note the existence of the planning permission, because it is there as a planning permission. It is also there as an allocation in this plan. And it's probably, for your purposes, it's more that it's an allocation in this plan that's more important, because that's one of the things that is in front of you. The planning history is, it's simply there. But I just wanted to make the point that I say it wouldn't be an appropriate approach to disregard the existence of that planning permission, because administratively that's what we do.
Councillor Jarman, were there any further points you wanted to?
Yes, I mean, I wasn't seeking to disregard that site. I was simply asking for your advice, which I was grateful to receive, that we should be generic rather than specific talking about that issue. The point I wanted to make, though, was that representations have been made on site allocation by local parish councils in particular, and those with neighbourhood plans. And the advice we were given, in fact, I think it's part of the government guidance on this, is that those neighbourhood plans do carry substantial weight in this. And where the representation of those neighbourhood plans was made into this planning process, one of the key things, particularly in our area, was that we did not want to see a proliferation and extension of the development boundary. And so allocating sites contrary to the neighbourhood plan outside of the previous development boundary is something we were very strenuous that should not occur. And yet it has occurred in this plan, and I suspect probably in other areas as well. So I think respecting neighbourhood plans should be a very strong guideline, as it is indicated, through the government machinery, in terms of development of local plans, specifically with sites outside of that. Thank you.
It was Ms. Goodyear next.
I just wanted to make sort of quite a brief point really about the importance of allocations, and to add to the points made. It's for the community and the councillors as well, because it gives them certainty about where the development will happen, and hopefully that will have a more positive outcome for decisions.
Thank you. I'm keen to move on in terms of the agenda, but Mr. Gentleman, as long as it's... Thank you. I'm now on item, I'm going to combine B and C under part 2 of my agenda. We've still got a fair bit to get through in the time available, so I appreciate kind of brief to the point submissions on various things. I think probably really to the council in the first instance. If we were to accept the 453 dwellings per annum as a sound kind of housing requirement, obviously, as we've heard at the start of this morning's discussion, there's a disconnect between kind of housing need. Other people have referred to the scale of the affordable housing need on the island, the extent to which we can be assured that if there are, I think we described them as potentially kind of negative effects that arise from a lower housing requirement, the extent to which they can be mitigated, perhaps through other policies of the plan. And I appreciate we're going to come on to in other sessions the details around some of the policies, but just generally how the council has thought about this and applied itself to that particular issue.
going to pass over to Mr Mills just to pick up the start of this one, and then we'll follow on from that.
Thank you, sir. So just briefly, HO 18 IPS Housing Evidence Paper C, implications of not meeting the standard method. That considers the range in terms of socio-economic and environmental impacts. So it's obviously there's a recognition there. And then again, in summary, the way that obviously the plan can't resolve all the issues, but in terms of policies, they're mainly through the housing policies in the Iron Plan, particularly H8 that looks to address the main potential negative impacts associated with a housing requirement that is lower than the local housing need by influencing different preferred housing mixes within the policy for both social and affordable rent to target the needs and also low cost home ownership dwellings. So obviously it's zeroing in on those that are identified to be most impacted by the reduced number.
Again, just a follow-up point to that. I think in terms of the scale of sites, again, one of the items that I raised yesterday right at the start of the sessions was obviously that need for affordable housing. And so obviously as part of that approach, the policy approach is to allocate sites in excess of 10 so that those sites provide on-site affordable housing. So obviously that again is one of the factors that's in our mind when we're looking at the implications of not meeting the standard method need, but recognising there will be impacts to that and how we potentially address them through other policies. We could have taken a different approach. We could have allocated lots of sites of less than 10 units, but then they wouldn't deliver any affordable housing on site. So we're not necessarily directly addressing that potential impact.
Thank you for that. And we also then further asked, I think, that MIQ 211, this kind of dovetails with what we were discussing yesterday around the economy as to whether, again, there's a potential tension between having a lower housing requirement than the standard method and the council's kind of aspirations or objectives in relation to economic growth, and whether, again, we can find the 453 figure sound in terms of what the council's intending to do around employment, land and economic growth. Mr. Brewer.
Thank you. Yeah, and obviously I won't rehearse or go over the conversations we had yesterday on this, but some of that will equally apply. And I think, you know, again, we recognise through the evidence base, certainly in EC1, that the level of economic growth has to be supported by an equivalent level of housing requirement. Obviously, there are provisions in the plan that can go beyond. And again, a really important point here, the word ceiling is being used. It's certainly not being used by the council. 453 is not a ceiling. If you could probably more describe it, if we're going down the house analogy as a floor, and you look up from the floor. So there is the potential for more development to come forward through the plan. That point is recognised in document EC1. And again, the triggers within the plan itself around potential higher completion rates and what that would then mean for re-looking at the housing requirement again. So I think, you know, that there is obviously a risk that link between housing delivery and economic growth. But, you know, I guess the other way of looking at it is if we're not in a plan-led development system, which we aren't at the moment, and we potentially may not be if the housing requirement is set too high, then that would also have negative implications on economic growth.
From the council's perspective, I mean, would it be a fair sort of assessment or way to look at things that getting plan-led kind of certainty and the benefit of that outweighs potentially some of the other potential benefits if there was a higher housing requirements around to help deliver affordable housing needs? Is really the kind of it's the plan-led certainty that's really what's kind of, is that primarily kind of behind or informing the 453?
Absolutely, and I say it's why I opened up with that point this morning. Really, is exactly that. You know, the purpose of adopting a local plan is to ensure plan-led development. If within 1 or 2 years the policies that plan are certainly around housing are rendered out of date because of the housing delivery levels, then you don't have plan-led development. And so all those other policies that we've got within the plan, looking at some of the really key issues And, you know, we've really focused on housing, but there's so much more in the plan in terms of some of the policies that we're trying to deliver. Certainly when we think about the environment and community, and we'll come on to those in separate sessions. You know, we want to make sure that we can use them to the fullest of their ability, and that is the kind of fundamental point behind all of the approach we're seeking to take. But recognising that obviously things can change, and whether that's through the triggers set out in the plan itself, or potentially plan reviews, which, as we discussed yesterday in detail, will happen through some mean or other, then absolutely the recognising those can take place as well.
So can I just also add a point which may be part of this question, but it's also more a matter for probably next week. But there's the requirement, and then there is the supply to meet the requirement. And in terms of this issue and the question of harms of having a requirement that is, in the view of at least some, set lower than it should be, and we've explained why it's set at the level that it is. But in terms of some of the harms that are perceived to come from that, to an extent, the supply side can provide some of the answer to that issue, in that whilst we think that there are limits to what can be realistically delivered over a sustained period of time, you wouldn't need necessarily to change the requirement to test that, in that if the supply had, sometimes the word buffer is sometimes used as a way of describing it. Obviously, the size of a buffer could provide a mechanism, or as it were, not quite experimenting with what happens in terms of deliverability, but it could provide flexibility in terms of deliverability without undermining the key thing that's driving the council's perspective, which is plan-led. So the requirement and all those issues in relation to the housing delivery test and obviously the 5-year supply, they will obviously anchor off the requirement. The buffer might have, in a sense, more scope for flex on it, and obviously we can talk about the supply side later on. But I've just sort of put that in your mind, as it were. Well, I'm sure it's already in your mind, but as a thought, that there may be issues around the supply side that might address some of the issues that, where there are concerns expressed about harm, that they could provide a vehicle for dealing with that.
Can I share some other things that are in my mind on this particular issue, which I'm sure other people have a view on? I understand the council is very keen to sort of advocate 453, as Mr. Brewer says, is a floor, not a ceiling. It's I think proposed modifications to clearly express it as a minimum requirement. And we'll come on to, I think, further discussions around whether the policies within the plan create sufficient conditions for, I think, some of the flexibility buffering that I think you're talking about, Mr. Bedford, given the council wants to move away from SP1 through to what clearly you could argue is be a more plan-led kind of approach, and to provide certainty. So it's the kind of the realism as to how far away, and how, as you say, Mr. Bedford, as an experiment or to kind of be tested, you know, delivery can kind of exceed that through the policies in the plan. Allied to that, if we were to accept 453 as a sound figure, that this is the island's realistic market kind of led figure, lower than the standard method, as we discussed yesterday, coming down the tracks with the MPPF will be plan review. I mean, what are, it's kind of, will the council, to what extent will the council kind of say, well, 453 was found sound only just very recently. That's been tested, and it's been accepted that that's the, you know, that's the market capacity for the island. So the new standard method figure comes out, which I think is going north of 1100. That's that figure. But look, we've proven and we've demonstrated that the most the island can really realistically do is 453. So we're just going to perpetuate, and there's going to be this cycle But this is the island figure. It's 453, and it's going to be very difficult to come away from that figure, because on the council's evidence and argument, that's what the island can sustain. It can do no more, no, not significantly more, to kind of move away from that figure. So I think that's something we're going to have to sort of think about in terms of the soundness of that particular approach. And there was a third thing, and as always, when I start thinking about things in number, the third one has kind of drifted. It's come back to me. If we want to potentially test market appetite and the ability of the market, I think it was picked up by Mr. Barine earlier, an alternative approach would be to have a step trajectory. Say in the early parts of the plan period, we would have something that's more attuned to recent delivery rates, or not too different. Then we would set in the building blocks in the mid to later periods of the plan period through potentially additional significant allocations. That would give time for either the market to respond, or the council to look at some of the barriers that have been identified in the Three Dragons report and other evidence, see what the council could do to overcome some of that delivery. But if it's through plan review process, the council seeing and has got the data and the intelligence that that step trajectory is not going to come to fruition because the market hasn't responded or engaged in the way perhaps that it has in the past when there were previous significant allocations, going back to the two sites we were talking earlier in Newport and Cowes, that would be an alternative way. Not sure if I'd use the word experiment, but to kind of test whether there are ways for a plan-led approach to kind of see whether there are opportunities or options to move away from kind of past trends, what's happened in the past, in line with what's clearly expected through the National Planning Policy Framework to significantly boost the supply of houses. So you've had a bit of an insight into some of the cogs and machinery that's kind of turning, certainly in my mind, whether I can, through the power of osmosis, project those onto the impressionable Mr. Steen, I don't know, but there's a lot there to unpick. Apologies, I've kind of just had shared some of the thought that come onto the agenda later on as part of this discussion. So I understand where the council is coming from. There are obviously alternatives, and presumably the council has thought about some of these options of step trajectories and etc.
So can I say, certainly we very much appreciate, as it were, the airing of thoughts, and clearly they're not yet conclusions, because they are, obviously this is still part of your information gathering part of the examination, but it's certainly helpful to have that sharing of thoughts and matters that may be in the sort of ether as proposition. Could I, and I don't want to obviously spend too much time on this, but just in terms of the point about the issue of, well, if the council were to have a plan adopted with a particular requirement in it, would that in some way limit, as it were, what would happen for the next round of plan making, just on that particular point? So I think that we would say that that should not really feature heavily in the process for the right outcome for this examination, and for two reasons. The first would be that any subsequent plan will need to be supported by its own evidence base and tested in accordance with the relevant guidance for that, which obviously at the moment is slightly opaque because we don't quite know what the government will decide to do with some of the those reforms. But I say that process will need to be supported by its own evidence base. Clearly, it will be able to take into account the output of this process, but that won't be the, as it were, the sole determinant. So that's the first aspect to it. And then I think in terms of the second element of that, clearly, if you're persuaded by the evidence that we put forward that this is the appropriate approach, then say that ought to be the conclusion, because obviously if it's sound, then that is the answer. On the questions of step trajectory as opposed to simply dealing with matters through a buffer, clearly there are different permutations on that. I think we probably would think that a step trajectory, you would have to have some confidence that each of the steps in the trajectory was deliverable at the time that, you know, as it were, the step up would come. So one would need to have, in a sense, some rationale for taking particular points and then saying, well, by this point it ought to step up to X or to Y. But so it's the principle of respecting the plan-led system in terms of the housing delivery test, the 5-year land supply. We certainly would be, as it were, more comfortable with an initial phase which is in line with where we think we're at in terms of what we think is deliverable. And I suspect that because of the need inevitably for plan review, it may well be that any higher trajectory in a stepped basis would itself become, as it were, slightly overtaken by events if there were to be a subsequent plan. But and I say, I earlier referred to the idea of a buffer as to whether that deals with some of the harms that might be perceived by some. Thank you, Zara.
Brewer.
Yeah, just one follow-up point on what Mr. Bedford said, and I suppose there's two key numbers in my head. One is the standard method, which I think we've spoken about today, is the kind of alternative effectively to where the council is, which is 703 units a year. And then if you look back at let's say the 5 boom years, 2 years after the adoption of the UDP, with national house builders on site, significantly different financial conditions in terms of development finance. The average in those 5 years was 612. So that isn't even at the standard method. So I think from an island perspective, we just have to be really careful about, if we are thinking about steps, what those steps are, because as we've had a really good positive discussion this morning around some of the key issues that we face on the island and some of the potential ways around that. But if we're looking back, as we have done over evidence and data, then the best period we've got is 612 homes per year in a short 5-year period. I think we can go any shorter than 5 years. I think that's probably right. So again, with the standard method at 700 and potentially going to 1100, really got to be careful. And again, goes back to our point around delivery. That's the fundamental point of this, to maintain that plan-led development. You've got to be really careful about some of the jumps that we think the island could make, when history shows that even in the best conditions, it hasn't got near that.
Thank you. As part of that evidence base, Mr. Brewer, and it might lead into sort of point E on my agenda. I will come back and bring in other people. We asked there, I mean, sometimes you do get planning authorities that will argue for a lower housing requirement, because I think somebody pointed out previously, paragraph 11 of the NPPF, there are particular reasons, or they've just simply physically not got the land supply to meet the housing requirements, and that's been accepted. In the case of the Isle of Wight, I mean, obviously we've done a strategic housing land availability assessment in 2022 and looked at presumably the capacity of those sites. I totally accept and appreciate it's not allocating sites. It's a step well before then. But just in quantitative terms, is the Schlar evidence saying that the island has not got the capacity to step up in any way to either inform a step trajectory towards meeting 703?
I think I guess the simple answer to question E and what you just said there is that you know we're not promoting the lack of available land as the reason for the approach we're taking in the plan. You know, the island does have a number of environmental constraints. 50% of it is AONB, national landscape, sorry, but that's not part of the approach that we're putting forward. And I think we've talked this morning already about pipeline of supply and sites with permission, and that can be relatively strong in short periods of time. But we're not promoting those constraints. I know obviously Worthing is a really good example recently of a local plan where they took a similar approach to us in terms of not arguing the standard method, but housing requirements down here because they simply didn't have available land. Obviously, we're not doing that. We're going down the delivery route. So that's not part of the approach we're putting forward.
Thank you. I can bring in others then on this point. I think probably hear from Mr. Beraint first, then Mr. Gentleman, Mr. Beverley, and then Councillor Jarman.
Thank you, sir. I think you actually raised a number of points that I was again to raise in terms of the concern if you set up a 453 DPA. Sorry, I was increasing your requirement then. In terms of delivery and whether that becomes set in stone, I think we look at cases that we have in terms of Reigate and Banstead, who went through a local plan, had a local plan adopted just after the MPPF was adopted, and then self-reviewed and continually said, "Oh, we don't need to," because the inspector said we don't have enough. That was greenbelt circumstances and saying that those circumstances haven't changed, but kept, and it's that self-review. So it puts me a concern in terms of that could just be used as a reason for maintaining that level of supply, saying this is the conditions now within the Isle of Wight. So I would agree, share your concerns, and I think it is important to recognise that. Now I forgot my point from making that too, so it'll come back to me, I'm sure. But I think yes, it's in terms of the way the council approached it. In terms of it feels slightly back to front in terms of, well, we'll review if we think we can do more, rather than look at it in terms of I think that's what I'll do is there we go. I think it might have been close to this one. I think. So it's in terms of that, actually, what can you do? What supply is there, and how much can you deliver? Rather than saying, well, this is what we think we can deliver, but we might try and do more. I think there's the experimental approach of providing more allocations to see whether you can, or as you suggest, sir, in terms of a potential step in terms of recognising that we want plan-led delivery. We recognise that the circumstances have led to lower levels of delivery, and how do you step that up? How do you ramp it up in terms of that supply? And I think that's the approach that I would have expected the council to have taken. And we've seen it elsewhere in terms of recognising. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but in terms of the where you have had low levels and had to go up to a much higher level of delivery, and actually try to support that through allocations and allowing the market to build up. Because the Isle of Wight is it is an island, but it still has very clear and good connections to the mainland in terms of transport and getting those materials and approach across, no more or less so than areas that are a long way from major population centres potentially in terms of cities and things like that would have, I think it was mentioned before about Margate and over in Swale, again, significantly further away from some markets than potentially the Isle of Wight is. So it is about how do we get there, potentially, rather than saying, oh, this is all we can do. And I think that's my main concern, but I think you reflected that better than I did, sir. Was one thing in terms of the negative impacts. I think what we need to look at it is in terms of the positives that are coming back from housing delivery, and that is related to that affordable housing. It is related to some of the biodiversity gain that will be achieved in terms of 10%. I think that is reflected in some of the councils. So there are positives from that 453, but there will be those positives moving forward in terms of infrastructure, affordable housing. And given that I think it's 489 dwellings per annum in terms of the affordable housing need, that's a substantial need in order to be addressed. I think that's set out within the local plan itself. So granted, I don't think you would expect all that to be met, but there is clearly a need that would be better met through the delivery of further allocations. Thank you, sir.
You, Mr. Gentleman, next, please.
Thank you. I think looking at a plan should be ambitious. It should look at what we need, and we should be ambitious about how we get there. To look at imposing a floor, as it's been referred to, which I don't see it as a floor. I see it that the 453, the gentleman next door to me referred to, will become something that is pulled back and clipped. When I look at the allocations that are in here, and I think back to the 2018 SLA process, which I was involved in, sitting on a panel, which was far more wide-reaching, the land allocations that were brought through there were many and varied. I look at the land allocations that are in this plan. There aren't any sites below 10, and I appreciate that there's been reasons applied for that, but there should be. Those sites should be allocated. When I look at the plan in detail about how we get to those smaller sites, the suggestion is that they're led by windfall, but the windfall policy in this document is tightened over the last policy, yet we're expecting it to deliver more. That doesn't make any sense. Every which way I look at this, I just feel that what we're doing is we're constraining what we're capable of doing. It was really interesting to hear you refer to an alternative stepped approach. You know, accepting at the moment that without having clear plan and allocations, it's difficult to ramp up immediately. But we should be considering an alternative. You know, to say that we're going to clip a number and just hold back by that, we're not looking at something that is forward-looking and ambitious. Looking back at historic delivery is one thing, but if we look back at history and we were always measured by the history of what we did, well, there would be no progress. There are social consequences for not delivering housing. Try again. Social consequences for not delivering housing. And as a consequence, there needs to be the stick to deliver that housing, because the social consequences of undelivery are something we are facing UK-wide at this moment in time. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's Mr. Beverley next, and then Councillor Jarman.
Yeah, thank you, sir. It goes back to what I said this morning, but and the point that I made in relation to the council's life would have been a lot easier had they have advanced the exceptional circumstances argument that it's been advocated in the room. But the fact that they haven't means that there's an inherent harm built in not delivering that, because the council's position is this is the need, but 350 dwellings per annum, we're not going to be delivering. So there is inherent harm in that disconnect. There's also inherent harm that Mr. Mills helpfully pointed yourselves to in respect of the council's evidence. I'd also point to I won't read it out now just because of time, but the exceptional circumstances paper, paragraph 5.9, talks quite, strongly about the harm of a reduced housing requirement. The employment evidence and some of what's said this morning is said, and it goes to this disconnect between the council's employment strategy and housing strategy, and they're quite a positive employment strategy, but very constrained housing strategy, and the disconnect between that and the response is, well, actually, it goes back to this point of it's a ceiling, we can deliver more, but that's not what the plan's fundamentally doing. And actually what we've heard around the room is relying on windfall to meet them economic aims is probably not sensible, given the history and given that we're moving away from the more permissive co-op strategy environment. And essentially the balance that's being asked as part of this plan is to accept that the harms to the potential loss of a plan-led system versus the inherent harms that I've just identified. So not delivering the representative amount of market housing, affordable housing, disconnect between employment and residential strategies. And the council's view is the harm of the loss of that plan-led strategy outweighs the inherent harms that's in the council's own evidence base. But what is the harm of the loss of a plan-led strategy would actually be potentially the delivery of more market housing. Now, the council's point will be, that might be in less sustainable locations, or in locations not where they want it, but actually, you know, the harm arising, one of the harms arising would be actually increased housing delivery, and the allocations could still come forward in that context. And I suppose kind of the disappointing thing is there's a recognition of the need, but just no attempt to even try. So I think that's why the discussion of step trajectories, it's in our response to question 2.19. We advocated for that approach because I do, going back to what I've just said, I do actually have a lot of sympathy with officers and particularly residents members, and they don't want to have a local plan that very quickly becomes out of date, and trying to work with the council in a more positive way so that we actually have the development sector is given a go to deliver, and then at future plan reviews, if that hasn't materialised, then I think the council's argument would be a lot more stronger to say, look, we have increased the supply and it's simply not delivered. But at the minute, you know, going back to the example that Mr. Brewer gave, when the UDP came in, that was the highest levels of delivery. So, you know, it doesn't quite align. So I just think, yeah, going to the point that Mr. Gentleman made, it's let's be positive and aspirational and actually give the development sector a chance, rather than the kind of backward approach of you know, oh, well, if things improve, then we'll review it in future plan reviews. I think actually the point of planning is to be aspirational. So let's be positive now, and we can rein that back in if the development sector doesn't deliver for the reasons that the council is saying that it won't.
Thank you. Just for bringing other people on this, I mean, just from just to pick up on something that Mr. Beverley touched upon there, from the, obviously, you explained, Mr. Brewer, the council's very obviously wants the certainty of a plan-led system. Thinks that the housing requirement of 453 is a reflection of kind of realistic but aspirational level of market delivery is the way to secure that. Being slightly sort of devil's advocate, so where does the harm arise? If you're planning for the most that the market can deliver, at 453, where's the kind of the risk going to come from for further kind of ad hoc development potentially within the plan period, if you've already met what you think is going to be the maximum or towards the higher end of the kind of the market's ability?
I think that point goes back to the conversation we started off with this morning around housing need and housing requirement. You know, the council's position is we're not arguing standard method. We appreciate and recognise there is a need for more housing on the island to address some of the issues we've talked about this morning, not least the delivery of affordable housing. You rightly say, the approach we're putting forward is what we think is realistically deliverable by the market. That kind of gap between the two and the potential harm that might, I guess you could apply harm to not meeting that gap, and also harm to stepping up from 453 to the standard method. And I think, you know, the approach, and I think Mr. Beverley really eloquently put it out, really, that our view is that the lack of a plan-led system does create a high degree of harm. We've heard this morning around since the core strategy, which didn't have any allocations, and all the challenges the development sector have felt that were brought into the process. So if we then just effectively, you know, and the kind of the tag's been labelled that we're in this kind of self-perpetuating, can't get my words out, you know what I mean, of delivery, but then you could also argue we'd be in a self-perpetuating non-plan-led system if we took the approach of setting the housing requirement too high. So again, that's why we tried to pitch ourselves what we think will do both. It will provide the ability to housing come forward, it will provide certainty through allocation, it will provide flexibilities for additional housing to come forward if it's policy compliant, with triggers in the plan to look at the situation of delivery did exceed the 453, but also recognising and maintaining, as I said right at the start this morning, I'll keep coming back to the necessity for plan-led development.
I think just pick up a further point with the council in terms of their evidence to this examination, in terms of if we were aligned in the council's kind of thinking about kind of the ability of the market to deliver. The council referred to a lot of other authorities are in a similar position, facing higher standard method figure, potentially even higher under the revised standard method. So the market capacity and ability is going to be kind of directed and absorbed a lot of other locations, which I think the council is advocating would be more attractive to the house building market than potentially coming to the island. Does the council have any evidence to that, or is that a kind of a sort of an assertion that that's like the likely behaviour of the market?
I guess there's two parts to that answer. One is kind of pre-new MPPF from the government and pre-new standard method, and then post. And obviously pre-standard method, obviously we've done engagement with the major national house builders over the course of this plan making process, and the feedback we have is that the island sometimes it just doesn't even appear on their patches, and whilst it's anecdotal, we don't need to spend too long looking at LinkedIn when you have development searches for major national house builders, and often the island doesn't even appear on the area of search. It's either greyed out or it's not even there. And certainly the feedback we get from those the correspondence we've had with the house building market is exactly that. And we haven't made the point yet this morning. We're at a local plan examination. We're looking at housing requirements significantly below the standard method, and we have no major national house builders either promoting sites or appearing in the examination. I think certainly in all the local plan examinations I've been involved in from both sides of the fence, that's quite rare. And I think again that helps to potentially crystallise some of the issues that we face on the island. I'm not saying that can't be overcome. And again, some of the conversations we've had this morning around potential large sites and looking at buffers, etc., may assist with that. And I guess the second part is kind of post-standard method. So that's more assertion. So absolutely the higher standard methods on the mainland create opportunities for significant housing growth in parts of the country that potentially have higher values and higher returns for developers. There's no getting away from that. I think that's a fact. And so that position of the island in effectively a wider marketplace, competing with some of those sites that may come forward in those areas, again, is part of the conversation. It's not the only part of it. Again, it's just part of that conversation. Certainly moving forward, as plans on the mainland look to potentially try and address some of that increased housing growth, and that will become more of an issue. But that absolutely is an assertion, considering it's from, I guess, 2024 onwards, post-December.
As we sit here today for the statements of common ground, Portsmouth's not currently on track to meet its need. It's got unmet need. Southampton, unmet need. New Forest. So cumulatively within South Hampshire, potentially some limitations at the moment in terms of what the market can do in those areas. Just a thought I'm having.
Indeed, sir. But so you will have noted that if you, and this is in, I think, paper A at paragraph 5.2, where we have referred to the engagement with a range of national house builders, and they have identified their factors as to why the island is not seen as being an area that they target. So that is empirical evidence. It is also empirical evidence that you have no representations from any national house builders seeking to promote any sites on the island, which, as Mr. Brewer said, is probably quite a striking factor. I think it's probably fair to say that as to how national house builders will react to the opportunities provided by the new MPPF, we don't really have that much evidence yet, but you can see that the factors that they've identified already and that have come out of both the Three Dragons report and the University of Portsmouth reports, which you've got, so those factors will simply play out again in the context that if you can, as it were, achieve your returns in a less constrained market, commercial realities would suggest that that's where you would prefer to go rather than to a more constrained market. That's I say we've got so far on evidence, and then some of it has to be obviously a judgment because we're dealing with a future scenario.
Thank you for that. If I can bring in others then, please. So Councillor Jarman and then Mr. Long.
We heard earlier about the confidence to developers of a plan-led approach, and I think that's true, but I think it's equally true for communities to know in that plan-led approach, to give them the confidence of what their expectations are within the environment. And I think there are a number of opportunities that communities have put forward in terms of taking single-story high street properties and building up on them. We've heard recently that housing association on the island have started selling off properties, and perhaps there's an opportunity to take those and refurbish them into maisonettes. So there are these opportunities for developments which are below that 10 threshold, which was expressed earlier. And I think having the clarity on those would be very beneficial. Onto your point about a step-led approach, my concern there is that having an incremental step-led approach would also, although that would backload, of course, the overall target, it would also backload the obligations in terms of the developer community. So we have a number of policies already enacted through the council, which would have an impact on that. Carbon neutrality already being mentioned earlier as one of them. And whilst we haven't yet agreed the mechanism for calculating a total carbon cost for a building during the site, the build, the lifetime and its termination, once that overall calculation model is agreed, offsetting that per property is clearly going to be a major obligation on the part of developers. And I can see that some might regard it as somewhat unfair to have got in ahead of that in the early part of that step approach, and for the burden of that to fall on developers later in that within the planned period. So some concern about that step approach, unless there is equilibrium developed in terms of the model and the policies throughout it.
Thank you. Mr. Long, please.
Thank you, sir. Just got a few notes. I mean, ultimately, if we look at Portsmouth and New Forest and the National Park Authority, I think the island sits in an incredibly good space. We're not restricted we're restricted by the land mass and the water, but we're not restricted by National Park Authority. We're not restricted by like Portsmouth, who are literally locked by its boundaries. We're in a good place. We've got common ground. I believe that there are environmental constraints, but they're not affecting the land availability as per SHLA or even the iterations of 2018 onwards in plan supply. We're in a good place. We've got a good problem to solve, ironically. It's the debate between the consequences of setting the 4 or the lower housing number and the consequences of not delivering that and the consequences of not delivering it and the actions taken by government through the housing delivery test. That's the central rub of the fact. It's not about the ability of land to deliver that, which I think that's a marvellous problem to solve. Whether that's the stepped approach to consider as the suitable, reasonable solution. In relation to nationals, I do deal with them. They're a business. There's media speculation about land banking and etc. Not so much on the island, but what nationals need is they need stability for their shareholders. And what they do then is plan with risks as limited as possible, except unless they're going into strategic land promotion for next plan iterations. But what they do is they target areas that have got limited risks. Now, the consequence of going back to the soapbox of the island not having allocations, why would nationals come over here when there's considerable risk